Hey everybody, this is chapter 6 of part 3 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 3 of the book is titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory, and chapter 6 is titled Diagnoses of Crisis, the Historical Decline Critique of Revolutionary Theory. A specific strand of revolutionary theoretical inquiry emerged from the milieu of the new Marx reading. Emerging from the milieu of the new Marx reading is now expanding its reconstructive effort into a fundamental diagnosis of crisis. It is no longer merely revolutionary theoretical traditions, whether rooted in the labor movement or adhering to classical dichotomous patterns in the wake of Marx, that appear problematic to these thinkers. Rather, a specific reading of Marx's late works leads them to question the very notion of an emancipatory transformation of the capitalist mode of production itself. In doing so, they attempt to call into question materialist revolutionary theory on the very ground and by means of materialist dialectics itself. This particular strand of the debate has likely gained comparative prominence primarily because, in the wake of the Hegelian Marxist wave of the 1970s, it offers an alternative interpretation of Althusser's periodization of Marx's work. It addresses the hitherto neglected, yet gradually emerging on the agenda of movement politics, theme of the critique of industrialism, and in doing so it adopts an apocalyptic diction that proclaims, the disappearance of all manner of presumed elements and phenomena previously regarded as potential starting points for a revolutionary restructuring of capitalism. One here typically encounters a negative mirror image of Marxist-Leninist triumphalism and, optimism of endurance, an image that must initially have been felt as liberating by all those for whom, in light of the experiences of the 20th century, and particularly the crimes committed in Germany, the blind infatuation with the masses, the reality-detached rhetoric of proletarian revolution, and the subservience to authoritarian party structures could appear as nothing but cynical and repulsive. By way of illustration, Helmut Koenig can thus ultimately ask whether revolutionary theory, understood as the analysis of capitalism with a practical transformative intent, has, in the end become altogether impossible, not due to lack of intellectual capacity on the part of the subjects engaging in theory, but due to a society that no longer contains within itself any explosive contradictions, The diagnosis of crisis discussed here takes up central motifs of the Frankfurt School, above all its critique of the naive concept of progress, and its inquiry into the genesis of a subject corresponding to the demands of, late capitalist socialization, a subject whose very need structure requires its integration into authoritarian structures and ideologies. However, in contrast to classical critical theory, this problematization of the domain-determined form of the, material dimensions, use value, need structure, and labor process is undertaken by means of a reconstruction of Marxian theory. In his late 1976 work, Wolfgang Port, I have a piece by Wolfgang Port on traces of German nationalism in the anti-nuclear and the ecological movement in Germany in the 1980s, which is a very interesting piece. And you can kind of see from reading that piece how significant Wolfgang Port would be for later critics in the anti-national, anti-German milieu. In his 1976 work, Wolfgang Port addresses the capitalist determination of the form of use value with a revolutionary theoretical intent, thereby challenging the external juxtaposition of social form and material content within the framework of classical Marxism. He seeks to draw the consequences from Marx's insight, that capital is not merely a formal relation that leaves its content untouched, Port identifies a dual concept of use value in Marx, one that becomes historically possible once humanity has, through the agency of capital, emancipated itself from being, quote, nothing other than a merely needy creature, end quote. 1. First, Marx speaks of a, quote, trivial use value, derived from a conception of the human nature relationship that is both ahistorical and abstract. Consequently, this concept accentuates material products from the perspective of their utility for human beings and defines productive potentials in their, quote, object dimension, end quote. 2. However, alongside this must be placed a, quote, emphatic concept of use value, end quote, one that grasps, quote, living labor, or the productive potentials of labor power as they are developed under the conditions of a capital-induced social dynamic. This, quote, use value par excellence, use value understood as wealth, is something more than a mere aggregate of objects for immediate self-preservation, emerges initially from the trivial use value, insofar as the productive forces, oriented toward the creation of surplus product and liberation from natural compulsion, originate in the first instance from an activity still subject to the compulsion of immediate material production. Immediate material reproduction. Subsequently, however, this abstract concept of use value is, quote, modified and substantively determined, end quote, by the specific characteristics of the given social formation, specifically insofar as that formation dictates, quote, which material product constitutes a use value in terms of fostering the encirclement of human nature, and which does not, end quote. This use value, now substantively determined by its specific social form, emerges in turn as the criterion for defining the material preconditions of communism, standing in contrast to the, quote, rubbish of capitalism, a category of objects that are wholly determined by their capitalist form, and which moreover does not leave human nature unscathed. In what follows, we shall trace the development of these concepts within Port's argumentation, even though reading his exposition, which, as will become apparent, is often obscure and frequently creates a false impression of profundity, is further complicated by his chaotic train of thought and his essayistic style of presentation. According to Port, labor, insofar as labor is, quote, posited by capital, end quote, emancipates itself from being wholly determined by the, quote, natural nexus, end quote. According to Port, labor, insofar as it is, quote, posited by capital, end quote, emancipates itself from being wholly determined by the, quote, natural nexus, end quote. Labor produces the, quote, specifically capitalist use value, end quote, namely surplus product as wealth, for through it the worker brings forth, quote, more than his own body, end quote. Against this, it must be noted that the existence of a surplus product is here unjustifiably reduced to conditions of material reproduction that are, quote, posited by capital, end quote. Yet a surplus product, even bearing in mind Port's imprecise usage of the concept of, quote, capital, is to be found in natural economy modes of production as well, independent of any form of capital. The, quote, use value of labor posited by capital, namely the potential to be a productive history-shaping force, end quote, constitutes for Marx the very historical basis for the legitimation of capitalism. Its, quote, historico-philosophical productivity, end quote, to borrow Port's phrasing, consists in, quote, production for the sake of production, end quote, understood as the, quote, development of human productive forces, that is, the development of the wealth of human nature as an end in itself, end quote. However, this, quote, emancipatory use value of things, end quote, posited by capital remains a mere potentiality whose realization is still pending. For under capitalism, the possibility of liberating humanity from its determination by the natural nexus, from mere creaturely reproduction, assumes the specific form of surplus value production. Port begins by noting that for Marx, productive labor under capitalism constitutes a social category of form, that productivity relates purely to the generation of surplus value within a specific set of production relations and is situated entirely beyond any material criterion. Quote, a large portion of the annual product consists of the most pernicious products, those satisfying the most wretched cravings, fantasies, etc. Parenthesis, use value in parenthesis. This content is entirely irrelevant to the determination of productive labor, end quote. However, Port claims to identify two definitions of productive labor within Marx's work that allegedly contradict one another in their emphasis. In unpublished texts such as Theories of Surplus Value or The Results, productive labor is presented as a purely formal theoretical category, whereas in Marx's Capital is said to additionally, quote, satisfy the determinations of the simple labor process, unquote. That is, it must produce useful things. This juxtaposition may be characterized as artificial, but the fact that use value must invariably serve as the bearer of value is a premise familiar to Marx even within his purely formal theoretical definition of productive labor. This definition makes sense only if a use value has in fact been produced. That is, if a labor process, in whatever concrete form, has actually taken place. In the interpretation of, within capitalism, productively organized labor as the condition for the development of the material prerequisites of communism, a system in which wealth is essentially defined as available time, there now reveals itself a normative surplus of meaning inherent in the purely formal theoretical concept of productivity. If productive labor under capitalism is defined as labor that generates surplus value, and if the production of surplus value entails the ruthless and boundless expansion of material productive forces, a process that in turn constitutes the very condition of the possibility of communism, then the formal theoretical concept of productivity must also possess a, quote, qualitative dimension, one directed towards its, quote, transitory historical function, quote. Consequently, even use value, which is in the chapter on commodities, was still conceived merely as an abstract antithesis to value, is now substantively, or rather historico-philosophically, further determined. Use value, which Port now transforms into a normative category even in its material guise, is, in terms of its utility, now defined by its serviceability for the construction of communism. Conversely, this implies that, quote, if capital essentially produces things for which a rational society would find no use, then neither is capital itself any longer productive, nor is the labor that generates surplus value, quote. According to Port, in pre-capitalist commodity production, there can be no question yet of use value in this sense. Here it represents merely a, quote, piece of nature determined by human ends, end quote. Simple circulation is thereby conceived as a, quote, more developed form of barter, end quote, rather than as an abstract sphere of the overall capitalist reproduction process. Marx's remarks on simple circulation are thus interpreted as pertaining to a bygone era, one in which, quote, exchange is still accidental and superfluous, end quote, because it has supposedly not yet penetrated the production process and therefore serves only to mediate surplus products. Here, exchange value and use value remain external to one another. The former mediates the metabolism of the latter solely as an object, quote, existing outside it and independently of it, end quote, without, quote, modifying it. By virtue of the exchange relation seizing hold of production, use value now definitively sheds its indeterminacy and becomes substantively determinable as the use value of capital, namely as labor. Use value, it is argued, can no longer be situated, quote, outside the economic form relation, end quote. In the Grundrisse, Port's primary reference text, Marx, in light of this new determination of use value, poses the question of precisely how, quote, use value as such enters into the form itself, end quote, and whether this exerts an influence not only upon the concept of capital, conceived as a value in process that assumes the guise of money and commodities, thereby sustaining itself, but also upon the concept of value in general. As a positive determination of the truly, quote, complicated relationship, end quote, between use value and exchange value, or value, Port now cites, without further comment, the very series of questions posed by Marx that immediately follows this passage, wherein Marx attempts to conceptualize the relationship between exchange value and use value using categories drawn from the philosophy of identity. Quote, is not value to be grasped as the unity of use value and exchange value? Is not value per se as such the universal principle standing in relation to use value and exchange value as its particular forms? Question mark, end quote. In doing so, Port relies upon an irrational conceptualization of value, one that Marx himself subsequently abandoned, and continues to operate within this framework, conceiving of capital not as value in process that transcends the specific forms of commodities and money, but rather as a substance that merely assumes the guise of money and material use values. Thus, Port tacitly presupposes the very conflation of matter and form that he purports to derive as a historical product only later in his analysis. Consequently, in the derivation that follows, Port surreptitiously transforms commodities into mere, quote, Consequently, in the derivation that follows, Port surreptitiously transforms commodities into mere things in order to isolate as a residual category a, quote, non-material concept of use value, labor. Port thus conflates value and trivial use value. Quote, use value is non-capital. Capital consists of all material things. Therefore, use value is something essentially immaterial. Labor posited by capital is pure subjectivity, end quote. Port perceives here, at the level of objects, an identity between use value and value, an identity which is ruptured only by the opposition posed between capital, conceived as the sum of all material things in the form of products, and labor, conceived as the mere process of producing these products. However, according to Marx, capital is not value plus the sum of all, quote, material things, end quote, but rather an objectively mediated production relation that assumes the form of both money and commodities. As a social form, capital can only exist as a commodity, precisely because the commodity itself possesses a dual character. Viewed from the perspective of its social form, the commodity thus constitutes an element within a more complex social determination of form, a use value that serves as the bearer of surplus value. What Port seeks to, quote, derive here is the further determination of the concept of use value as a category that itself signifies a specific economic determination of form, namely, abstract labor as a use value for capital. That is, as a use value that enters into a constitutive relationship with capital by representing the consumption of a commodity which, under specific conditions of socialization, acquires the potential to serve as a source of value. Yet even this source of value is not labor in its concrete aspect, but rather in its abstract aspect. In other words, here too, no conflation of the material dimension with the formal dimension takes place. Labor can serve as a source of surplus value, and thus as a use value for capital, only if its potential (labor power) exists separately from the conditions of its realization as, quote, pure subjectivity, end quote, and is therefore exchanged and consumed as a commodity. Thus, neither is there an identity between the use-value aspect of commodities and capital, even when the former constitutes elements of the latter. Nor is it a property of labor linked to use value in the material sense that creates capital. Port now identifies, in a very specific sense, a relationship of inequality within the exchange relation between capital and labor power. While this exchange does indeed yield use values in objectified form to the worker, it simultaneously withholds from him, quote, the appropriation of the social productive forces created through labor, end quote. That is the, quote, use value par excellence, end quote. This use value implies liberation, understood as the, quote, setting apart of labor from human beings, end quote. That is, extricating it from a merely antagonistic mode of existence, i.e., from its existence in opposition to other human beings who are themselves posited solely as labor and suffer under this condition. It is precisely this that the capitalist mode of production renders possible. It does not merely reproduce a relationship of domination, as was the case in pre-capitalist epochs, but rather posits this very relationship of domination vis-a-vis itself, in the objectified form of capital. The content of the emphatic concept of capitalist wealth, a concept existing, to be sure, merely as an anticipation or potentiality, is thus, quote, not immediate enjoyment, but rather historical progress, a progress which, admittedly, must ultimately be measured against the standard of enjoyment, end quote. This emphatic concept of wealth, the possibility of the, quote, successive abolition of labor by labor itself, end quote, representing, quote, not just any consumer good, end quote, but rather, quote, the ultimate liberation from want and misery as a concrete possibility, end quote, remains alien to those who, while possessing consumable objects, lack the capacity for the rational shaping and application of productive forces, the capacity, in short, quote, to make history, end quote. Indeed, in the Grundrisse, Marx demonstrates that the capitalist production relation entails an expropriation of time, specifically of that freely disposable time, which is, in principle, rendered possible by advances in productivity. The inherent tendency of capital, Port notes, I said Port, but I think that should be Marx. The inherent tendency of capital, he notes, remains, quote, always on the one hand to create disposable time and on the other to convert it into surplus labor, end quote, Marx. According to Port, therefore, potential progress assumes the contradictory form of actual regression because even, quote, the meager disposal time that people had already won for themselves in pre-capitalist epochs is transformed back into working time, end quote. Nevertheless, this obstruction of the realization and socially rational appropriation of productivity gains does not constitute the actual substance of the Marxian concept of exploitation, as Port would have us believe. He appears to recognize only the alternative between a concept of exploitation, connoted by the theory of immiseration, and one framed by the philosophy of history, given that he emphatically and rightly asserts the expropriation of free time and of a historical subject status against positions that can cite, quote, no other legitimation, end quote, for revolution, quote, than the material misery of the proletariat, end quote. Port interprets the constitution of the worker as a pure subjectivity detached from the conditions for the realization of his labor power as an ambivalent achievement. On the one hand, he argues, this constitution creates the very possibility of individual freedom, but differentiating between the personal individual and the class individual, thereby positing the worker and his labor as non-identical entities, and thus distinguishing him as a subject from the means of production as objects. On the one hand, the worker is free only as a, quote, inactive object, quote, outside the production process, yet unfree within it, subjected to the command of capital, of which he becomes a mere object. In both instances, he is reduced to a state of mere nature, here to a needy corporeality, there to a blindly acting natural force. Through the function of labor as a use value for capital, quote, the old natural nexus, in which labor was not a free activity, i.e., free from immediate natural compulsion, but rather a mere thing, is not only dragged along but actually intensified, end quote. Marx too speaks of the really subsumed worker as a, quote, trained natural force, end quote, as a, quote, animated singular point-like entity, end quote, a, quote, living isolated appendage, end quote, of the machinery. The unity of production, which initially manifests in the figure of the capitalist as an alien purpose external to the process itself, confronts the worker within the mode of really subsumed production in the guise of the machinery, yet production remains nonetheless mediated by consciousness, never mere nature. For even if the internal telos of the valorization process consists of nothing other than the valorization of value, this process still ultimately rests upon the labor process, the production of, quote, trivial use values. Within this latter process, a specific object or service is brought forth, an output that, while not an end in itself, is not primarily oriented toward the satisfaction of human needs. Yet its production, even within the most heteronymous despotism of the factory regime, requires a conscious setting of purpose, in relation to which the metabolism between man and nature is defined as meaningful activity, as labor, and thus as a transformation of natural substances intended from the very outset. Thus report, capital posited use value and capital induced destruction of use value lie in close proximity. Only as long as capital possesses a counterpart that stands in contradiction to it does it produce use value in the emphatic sense. However, as soon as it has, quote, become a second nature, end quote, the meaning of which is elaborated upon later, the relationship between use value and value dissolves into a, quote, bad identity, end quote. Port's, quote, identity philosophical dramatization of the relationship between use value and exchange value, end quote, implies the thesis that value and use value have now genuinely fused, and that capital is therefore, quote, no longer a relationship, end quote. Quote, the illusion has become reality. Capital has become a thing, end quote. Since from the production process down to the canned stew, nothing remains but capital, any emancipatory rebellion is conceivable at most as mere, quote, machine smashing, end quote. Alongside this mystifying interpretation characteristic of the strand of revolutionary theoretical debate under discussion here, which construes, quote, real subsumption, end quote, as an objective fusion of formal and material dimensions, thereby rendering any formal transformation of material production unthinkable and retrospectively vindicating the fetishisms of political economy against Marx's theory of form. Port's other theses regarding the transformation of the capital relation also sound somewhat far-fetched. This is very interesting because I don't know how big of if he has any influence or whatever, or the influence of like primitivist thought at all in Germany, to which it's kind of like has any kind of mainstream, not mainstream, but I guess like penetration into discussions of capital. But if you think of this, is kind of like this sounds very much like the the ideas of Jacques Comte, who comes from, who's the results of the immediate production process and the concept of real subsumption that's kind of like fleshed out there, are very important for his turn from like Bourdieuist to like Bourdieuist politics and Bourdieuist ideas to primitivism. Check out the piece. I have one here by, I can't even remember the person's name. Ojami, I think their name is. Chasim Oljemi. I can't remember. Sorry, I'm fucking with their name. But it's a piece about basically a introduction to the trajectory of the thought of Jacques Comte, which definitely has this kind of thing of like capital kind of like fusing seamlessly in some capacity with its material substratum, or like technology as such is capital, or like a very capital being like machinery or something like that. That's my memory of it. Maybe I'm mischaracterizing. Come on. This is the case, for instance, when Port asserts that today capital quote can do without capitalists unquote. Unless this statement is intended to amount to the claim that canned stew is in of itself already capital, much in the way that the first Handex is for neoclassical economists, then at best Port can be credited with a flawed historicization of the concept of the capitalist, understood in the sense of the classical owner of the means of production and the patriarchal corporate magnate of the pre-joint stock company era. Marx already demonstrated in Volume 3 of Marx's Capital, or the book Capital, through his analysis of the, quote, social capital of joint stock companies, the credit system, and the separation of owners from functioning capitalists, that this historically immature ownership function, which is inadequate to developed capitalist conditions, does not constitute the form analytical concept of the capitalist. It is simply not evident that, through such modifications, the character of capital as a materially mediated production relation between capitalist and worker is thereby abolished. Nor can even those things determined by form go to market on their own. Rather, they continue to derive their form of determination exclusively from a social relation. Just like the capital relation, the validity of the concepts of, quote, necessary labor and, quote, surplus labor is now also held to be bound to the existence of a transient historical constellation, specifically in the sense that the former exists only insofar as it is oriented toward a, quote, pre-capitalist purpose, unquote, lying beyond itself, namely the, quote, preservation of living individuals, unquote. The category of surplus labor, too, is deemed meaningfully applicable only if its fruits are directed toward the reduction of necessary labor time. So let me repeat that. I fucked that sentence up. I said the wrong thing. The category of surplus labor, too, is deemed meaningfully applicable only if its fruits are directed toward the reduction of necessary labor. Port thus ties the distinction between necessary and surplus labor to a pre-capitalist constellation, even though just moments earlier the generation of a surplus product through surplus labor had been conceptualized as an essential result of capital. Quote, emphatic use value, unquote, must therefore evidently be understood as a coincidence of system-transcendent subjective goal-setting and system-immanent objectively labor process-driven productivization mediated by capital. Here, too, his inability to conceive of the concept of capital without importing normative demands external to capital becomes apparent once again. Thus, capital is falsely credited, quote, in accordance with its general tendency, end quote, with, quote, keeping the needs of living human beings in view, end quote. Yet necessary labor here is by no means oriented toward the, quote, provisioning of the population, end quote. Rather, it denotes the reproduction occurring within the capitalist labor process, of the sum of value required to sustain the respective labor power. This is entirely compatible with the mass perishing of human beings, including in the Third World. It speaks to Port's moral sensibility, though against his analytical capabilities, that he is unwilling to grasp this fact. Furthermore, the reduction of necessary working time is by no means a goal of capitalist dynamics as such. Rather, it is initially a blind side effect of the competition-driven hunt for extra profit, and ultimately a conscious means for expanding surplus labor, which, as unpaid labor, constitutes the capitalist potential surplus value. In capitalism, the objective of surplus labor is invariably the production of surplus value for the sake of surplus value production itself. Excuse me. Where the hell am I? In contrast, Port argues that under developed capitalism, human beings, by virtue of their substitutability by machines and the use value indifference of production, which now lacks any transcendent human purpose, are simply superfluous, and can therefore be, quote, tolerated or killed at will, end quote. Thus, in this context, human beings have lost their status as objects of exploitation. Rational utilization is supplanted by arbitrary destruction, a process that begins with purpose per se and ends with the human being, the very agent of purpose setting. Yet even this diagnosis, quite apart from the absurd transposition of the threat of extermination directed against Jews under National Socialism onto all human beings in, quote, late capitalism, is deeply flawed. It kind of sounds like, what's his name? Kind of like some of the things that is said by, what's the fucking guy's name? Agamben. According to Port, capitalism is characterized by a truly tragic ambivalence. On the one hand, as a form of exploitation mediated by objective exchange relations, it engenders a separation between the individual as a member of a class and the individual as a person, insofar as it is no longer direct coercion, but rather mere lack of ownership of the means of production that drives workers into externally determined activity and exploitation. Moreover, the products of labor are intended only secondarily for the personal well-being of the capitalist. Primarily, they serve instead the restless self-valorization of value, a process that implies the development of productive forces without regard to limited human ends. On the other hand, precisely this decoupling of production and the appropriation of surplus product, quote, from the ends of any living human beings, and quote, brings about a, quote, liquidation of the contradiction between labor on the one hand and free production and free employment on the other. End quote. The ultimate raison d'etre of exploitation, namely luxury and the enrichment of human nature, has thus been negated, a fact which, echoing Marx's critique of the mediocrity of bourgeois life, reveals itself in the, quote, dull, bloated, petty bourgeois hobbies, end quote, of the, quote, ruling class, end quote. Even Marx, Port notes, had similarly, quote, called into question the quality of bourgeois wealth, end quote, when he accused the bourgeoisie of being unable, quote, to utilize their privileges to create a mode of existence worthy of human beings, one that is worthy of envy and emulation, end quote. Yet for Port, this failure to transcend exploitation within capitalism, this self-referential character of exploitation which is indeed so difficult to grasp, this elevation of the very medium of social mediation into the sole purpose of productive activity, is now synonymous with the impossibility of ever transcending capitalism itself. Qualitative ends, in Port's view, appear to have been completely absorbed into the machinery of valorization and thoroughly corrupted by it. Rarely, however, does one find anywhere in the book a more concrete definition of this process. At the same time, entirely in the tradition of critical theory, Port constructs an image of a, quote, heroic capitalism of the bourgeois, end quote, whose specific historical time frame remains elusive, in which the bourgeois, through a curious interweaving of the, quote, feudal great individual, feudal great individual, end quote, and the modern, quote, free and equal subject, end quote, imposes upon the capitalist production process purposes that remain alien to it, purposes committed to the emancipation of the human race, the art of living, refined pleasure, intellectual development, For Port, the destruction of this emancipatory potential, however contradictory and exclusive its form may have been, within the context of fully developed capitalism, is synonymous with the alleged state of affairs that, quote, while there is still capital, there have long since ceased to be capitalists, end quote. Capitalists who, for their part, recognize free activity and free enjoyment only as feudal relics. This concept of the, quote, capitalist thus implies that capitalist production at some unspecified phase of historical development once took place for the sake of individual luxury. In this context, there is a cryptic mention of the capitalist production relation as a social relationship, quote, which determines the purpose of production, end quote. With the decline of this epoch, at the point where the, quote, non-contemporaneous, end quote, way of life of the capitalist was eradicated, and, quote, capital is merely capital, end quote, the concept of the capitalist is said to have lost its meaning. Port, therefore, does not conceive of this category as a designation for structurally determined action, subject to the autonomous compulsions of surplus value accumulation. Rather, he views it as a signifier endowed with a personal, moral, and substantively qualitative, quote, surplus, pointing back to that which once offered resistance within the now closed, self-identical system of impersonal, amoral, and substantively indifferent production. If capital tends to dispense with capitalists without a ruling class, then this means that the objective world is alien to human beings, not merely as the possession of other human beings, but in itself, in principle. Yet this alienation is not the pre-existing alienation of, quote, first nature, end quote. Rather, it is produced by human beings themselves, end quote. Capital, therefore, is productive in the emphatic sense and contradictory in the sense of revolutionary theory. Only at the moment when, quote, the memory of a declared purpose and a conscious intention behind production still resonates, end quote. Yet in the process of its unfolding, capital destroys precisely this transcendent teleology, for it subordinates human needs and objectives to its own blind, restless, and materially indifferent movement, thereby, as previously described, labor, which originally posits capital, is transformed into labor that is wholly posited by capital, entering into a, quote, purely material relationship, end quote. Quote, the very same social machinery that restlessly and relentlessly drives progress forward, because it makes surplus labor the condition for necessary labor, ultimately annihilates labor altogether, insofar as it liquidates the human purpose under which the material activity of human beings alone constitutes labor, end quote. Port thus posits that the very definition of human labor is contingent upon its teleological orientation toward enjoyment. Within the capitalist relationship, this orientation becomes, quote, more precarious, end quote. For here is not immediate enjoyment, but rather potential liberation from labor and want that constitutes the, quote, purpose and identity of labor, end quote. Port, therefore, evaluates capitalist surplus labor against a standard of purpose that is not its own. However, the realization of this historico-philosophical, quote, use value of labor, as posited by capital, is held to be the task of the socialist revolution. Consequently, only a successful revolution serves as proof of the existence of use value in the emphatic sense. This use value is thus teleologically oriented toward emancipation, analytically by way of anticipation, and in reality by way of revolution. Capital, it is argued, ceases to stand in an antagonistic relationship to human needs. At least initially, when it usurps the pre-capitalist life world it encounters. here idealized as the, quote, autonomous impulse to play cards, drink, dance, and to converse rather than to work, end quote. With this act of usurpation, the quasi-feudal production objectives of the capitalist are themselves subsumed. This state of affairs, it is asserted, became evident no later than with the advent of the culture industry, that is, the real subsumption of the consumer goods industry, in the broadest sense under capital. Consequently, Port contends, the existence of human needs distinct from capital can no longer be discerned. Alongside the subsumption of the sphere of consumption, a second factor, the real subsumption of the labor process under capital, is identified as contributing to the destruction of use value, indeed of labor and of the human being altogether. The reduction of the worker to a mere natural force is here solidified through the de-skilling and abstraction of activity into a specialized task indifferent to any specific content, an activity that ultimately degenerates into the mere extinction of procedures dictated by the factory's technostructure. The ambivalence inherent in the capitalist enhancement of productive forces has, therefore, passed away. Quote, if labor loses all artistic character and becomes merely material activity, this may signify one of two things. Either the labor necessary for life is finally no longer a feat of artistry, and, as a merely material activity, can therefore be performed by inanimate objects. This would constitute liberation. Or, labor that has lost all artistic character reduces those who are still compelled to perform it to dull-witted creatures, and is a merely material activity. It is an activity no longer determined by any human ends, end quote. This is held to signal the, quote, liquidation of the partial historical emancipation from nature, end quote, and thereby the end of dialectics. Real subsumption shapes the labor process in such an abstract manner that what remains is not merely a labor process as a form-indifferent abstraction. Rather, quote, indeterminacy here becomes positive, end quote. Quote, not an absence of form, but a form in itself, end quote, within which, quote, economic form determination asserts itself materially as empty, purposeless, restless doing, end quote. According to Port, a historico-philosophical potential for an emphatic use value existed only during a brief moment in the internal history of capitalism, the, quote, heroic epoch of the bourgeois age, end quote, a potential manifested in the fact that, quote, proletarian revolution was on the agenda, end quote. No concrete historical examples are offered in support of this claim. Port identifies an ephemeral contradiction within the constellation, articulated through the lenses of immiseration theory, whereby production exceeds the level of bare necessity on the one hand, while producers are restricted to a mere physical subsistence minimum on the other. Initially, this contradiction is conflated with the conflict between material content and economic form. Subsequently, however, it is linked to the inherent self-contradiction of the very concept of, quote, wealth as such, a contradiction said to reside in the disconnect between production and the needs of the producers, for whom the products, as use values, quote, ought, by their very concept, to provide satisfaction, end quote. But be that as it may, this contradiction is alleged to have manifested itself at the time in the, quote, recalcitrant will, end quote, of those excluded from social wealth, thereby suggesting the necessity of a revolutionary appropriation of that wealth. In this analysis, Port consistently operates with assumptions rooted in theories of historical decline, assumptions that in turn rest upon unacknowledged normative premises. Thus, Port argues that as the metropolitan working class came to share in the spoils of imperialist profit, its, quote, moral distinction, end quote, from the bourgeoisie faded. Consequently, quote, the material interests of the proletariat are no longer a reliable criterion for sound political action, end quote. Finally, he contends that fascism demonstrated the absence of any intrinsic link between wage increases and the reduction of working hours on the one hand, and the realization of communism on the other. Yet all these supposedly lost attributes and potentials are, in reality merely Port's own projections. Here, fascism is pressed into service to validate an insight, one to which observers may indeed have been alerted by the rise of fascism. That was, in fact, already clearly articulated in Marx's Capital. Thereby, this insight reveals itself to be a fundamental structural characteristic, applicable even to the supposedly, quote, heroic era of, quote, early capitalism. The underlying structure of this apocalyptic decline-oriented mode of thought lies in accepting, at face value, the naive immiseration-based and methodological revolutionary theory of traditional working-class Marxism, and subsequently dismissing it solely as a historical relic, as something merely outdated, rather than as something fundamentally erroneous. With the development of fixed capital, that is, the tendency toward the real subsumption of the labor process under capital, the historical legitimacy of the capitalist mode of production, which previously lay in creating the material preconditions for human emancipation, appears in Port's view to have become obsolete. Capital, Port argues, now generates a, quote, bad identity of use value and exchange value, a real confusion of formal and material dimensions, which renders the capital fetish a concrete reality while simultaneously rendering the use value of things unreal. The capital relation, he contends, is now, quote, no longer contradictory, comprising a, quote, good, productive force and a, quote, bad relation of production, but rather wholly and without any dialectical qualification, quote, bad, end quote, end quote. This, quote, dissolution of the contradiction between use value and value, end quote, becomes perceptible to everyday consciousness through the fact that, quote, it is scarcely possible to discern what else one might do with things other than sell them, buy them, or throw them away, end quote. That Port, much like Robert Kurtz would later do, tends to interpret Marxian metaphors literally, is evident in his reading of the following passage from Marx, when Marx observes that the economic formal determination of the labor process, specifically its character as a process of valorization, appears, quote, extinguished when the production process is viewed in isolation, i.e. that it remains invisible from this truncated perspective. Port reinterprets this observation as signifying the actual destruction of use value in the sense of an abstractification of the labor process itself. Third, Port links the existence of transcendent purposes as a precondition for the positing of labor and use value to the existence of a, quote, autonomous sphere of circulation. This sphere, he argues, was still to be found in the epoch of, quote, competitive capitalism, end quote, because in that era, the results of the production process were merely latently capital. The realization as values remained a matter left to chance, end quote, one that could founder in the consumer market against the barrier of effective demand. The existence of use value is thus tied to the disintegration of the internal unity of production, circulation, and consumption. A disintegration that constitutes the most abstract moment of the very possibility of capitalist crises. This separation of internally interconnected moments, a hallmark of the capitalism of quote, free competition, had remained unexamined in the isolated analysis of the production process. In that context, the valorization of value appeared, quote, entirely dependent solely on its relation as objectified labor to living labor, end quote. It was presupposed that the, quote, valorization posited within the production process constitutes its values real valorization, end quote. Now, however, this process must be viewed as contingent upon circulation. Consequently, it appears as something accidental, precisely because under capitalism, buying and selling, production and exchange are constitutively separated in both time and space. Thus, for Port, valorization is subjected to a, quote, condition that is restrictive both quantitatively and qualitatively, end quote. A condition intended, moreover, to offer, quote, resistance to the very boundlessness and aimlessness of capital. Quote, if the product finds no need to satisfy, then production, qua exchange value, stands in opposition to circulation, qua use value. If the product finds no equivalent, then production qua use value stands in opposition to circulation, qua exchange value, end quote. Quote, thus, it was in these ruptures, bankruptcies, and crises that capital found its historical reason, end quote. Port immediately associates this barrier to valorization, characteristic of this specific social formation, with the, quote, reason of human ends, end quote. It is only with the, quote, dominance of monopolies, whose extra economic power guarantees the unity of the production process and the valorization process, end quote, that this resistant, contradictory element supposedly vanishes. In doing so, Port unreservedly aligns himself with the tradition of the, quote, negative theory of monopoly capitalism within critical theory and its disciples, most notably Hans-Jürgen Krahl, with the unrealistic thesis regarding a, quote, substitution of circulation by the dictatorship of monopolies, end quote. Port reduces the producer's double separation, determined by both class relation and the existence of privately isolated production units, to the separation, with the unrealistic thesis regarding a, quote, substitution of circulation by the dictatorship of monopolies, end quote. Port reduces the producer's double separation, determined both by class relations and by the existence of privately isolated production units, to the former alone. He posits a form of, quote, negative direct socialization, end quote, that allegedly manipulates the law of value solely for the purpose of exploiting workers within the immediate production process, thereby, much like his intellectual mentor, Hans-Jürgen Krahl, entangling himself in theoretical paradoxes. For Krahl himself had already asserted that, under, quote, late capitalism, value is, quote, produced directly within the very production of use values, end quote. However, this would imply that concrete labor is already immediately social in nature, thereby creating a contradiction with the category of value, a category that signifies the unity of privately dissociated labors. If Krahl's thesis is not to be regarded as a mere metaphor, then it becomes impossible to speak meaningfully of value and capital any longer. All that would remain is the exploitation of a surplus product, a regression to appropriation mediated directly by force. Yet Port too continues to speak of a, quote, capitalist economy, of the struggle for, quote, profits, and even of crises and, quote, economic development that have supposedly, quote, emancipated themselves from the law of value, end quote. For Port, state-mandated armaments production evidently serves as the paradigm of late capitalist socialization. Thus, capitalists A and B, quote, establish a fund that purchases their surplus product. The extent of the sales guarantee provided by this fund is determined by their political power. The purchased surplus product is then destroyed, end quote. The, quote, folly regarding the impossibility of overproduction, end quote, a notion Marx once criticized among economists, has in this view become a reality. The replacement of the naturally evolved socialization of labor embodied in the law of value by the, quote, modern arbitrary rule, end quote, of monopolists not only emancipates their dominion from the resistant force of autonomous circulation, but also implies their independence, quote, from the conditions that they may rule, quote, from the condition that they may rule only insofar as they act as producers of the development of productive forces, end quote. Capital, conceived as an objectively mediated social relation, now fragments into the arbitrary rule of persons on the one hand and the overwhelming power of things on the other. Whereas personal rule in pre-capitalist conditions was invariably bound up with the powerlessness even of the rulers themselves in the face of nature, it is now bound up with a powerlessness in the face of a second nature, petrified into a mere object, namely the capital-induced productive force of capital fixe. I guess like fixed capital, which is machinery, things that aren't immediately destroyed in the production process. A point vividly illustrated by the example of a nuclear war. Modern personal rule, with fascism serving as its archetype, is characterized as a form of domination whose constraints can no longer be grounded in an undeveloped relationship between humanity and nature, specifically the compulsion for the many to labor for the sake of developing the human nature of the few. Consequently, it can only be described as senseless, indeed as, quote, utterly incomprehensible, unquote. Not only does Port engage here in a grandiose mystification of fascism, but he also conflates two distinct categories of reason, one normative and one analytical, when he asserts that theory can only rationally comprehend its object, quote, if that object itself embodies this very reason, at least partially and in a refracted manner, end quote. Marx, he suggests, was able to grasp capitalism as a relation of exploitation, reason in the analytical sense, solely because he understood it as a means of fostering the development of productive forces, a prerequisite for human emancipation, and was thus able to deem it rational, reason in the moral sense. The theoretical and practical reason, the rational comprehension of an internal logic, versus the active rationalization, and the process of grounding and justification, all become hopelessly entangled here, masquerading as profound insight. Finally, a fourth process of subsumption may be regarded as a further factor in the destruction of use value. The production of the general conditions of capital's production, such as infrastructure, was initially left to the state. Let me repeat that. Finally, a fourth process of subsumption may be regarded as a further factor in the destruction of use value. The production of the general conditions of capital's production, such as infrastructure, was initially left to the state, since capital, during the phase of its consolidation against pre-bourgeois modes of production, could not yet manifest itself in use values, quote, that cannot be privately appropriated, end quote. Production was thus taken over by the state, acting as the, quote, modern archetype of the pre-capitalist real community, end quote, which appropriated the necessary means, taxes, through direct coercion. Marx identifies the emergence of joint stock companies as the specific condition for the subsequent assumption of the production of these general conditions by capital itself. Port interprets this process, which Marx somewhat misleadingly terms the, quote, abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, end quote, in a specific manner, as capital's transition into the phase of its self-constitution as a real community, albeit in the regressive form of despotic dominion over production, quote, as a producer for immediately socially posited needs. It itself becomes socialized, end quote. Quote, from approximately 1871 onwards, end quote, the individual capital owner characteristic of competitive capitalism was, due to the colossal scale of investment volumes required in heavy industry and the transport sector, displaced by joint stock companies, which alone possessed the capacity to operate these sectors competitively. This marked the beginning of the substitution of the law of value by the market power of large monopolies, a phenomenon first emerging in the banking sector and subsequently, it is argued, reached its ultimate conceptual realization within, quote, fascist steering bodies of the Speerian mold, end quote, as in like Albert Speer. Consequently, parliamentary democracy too has supposedly become obsolete for the direct communication among a select few monopoly magnates, within which total capital has acquired an almost tangible existence, no longer requires an indirect medium to establish the common interests of the ruling class. Parliamentarism, which is supposedly necessary only when aggregate capital exists merely within the antagonistic, uncoordinated nexus of autonomous private producers, i.e. as competition, is thus, in faithful Stemocap parlance, replaced by the quote, direct contact between the magnates of industry, banking, and politics, who have by now become virtually indistinguishable, end quote. Drawing without explicit attribution upon Johannes Agnoli, who, it must be noted, by no means shares the underlying theory of monopoly, the de facto persistence of parliaments is explained as the result of an epochal shift in function, from the representation of private interest to the organization of political allegiance. Port here peddles the old refrain of, quote, monopoly capitalism, a trope trotted out ad nauseum by everyone from social democrats to Marxist-Leninists, as if it were a profound truth that has, quote, scarcely yet made the rounds among Marxists, end quote. Capital, he argues, no longer posits any emphatic use value, since its production is no longer measured against the ends of consumers. It is here that the final subsumption takes place, the subsumption of the once autonomous representative of the Commonwealth, the state under the dominion of capital. In this process, the state, which guarantees general conditions of production that are not sufficiently profitable for private capital accumulation to provide on its own, mutates into the custodian of an emphatic emancipatory rationality. Quote, the government's sovereignty vis-a-vis capital confronted the latter with human ends which, in order to secure the consent of the citizenry, had to be grounded in reason. This reference to the supposedly former autonomy of the capitalist state reveals that Port 2 is incapable of identifying the state of capital. This reference to the supposedly former autonomy of the capitalist state reveals that Port 2 is capable of identifying the state of capital only in the guise of a state of capitalists. That is, only insofar as it remains the, quote, private property of private owners, end quote, or insofar as those owners have effectively become, quote, employees of the state. The purpose of capital now lies exclusively in its self-reproduction as a real community, as a form of the direct socialization of labor and products. Quote, its purpose is no longer the tearing down of all barriers to production, but rather bare survival as an once established system, end quote. Capital has thus, to summarize Port's argument, emancipated itself from use value in four ways, or has completely subsumed it beneath itself. 1. Through the usurpation of a pre-capitalist life world belonging to both the workers and the ruling class. 2. Through the real subsumption of the labor process. 3. Through the liquidation of the sphere of circulation. And 4. Through the genesis of joint stock companies and monopolies, as well as their fusion with the state. Port is evidently, and perhaps semi-consciously, cobbling together a theoretical fallacy in order to label phenomena that he is incapable of analyzing. In doing so, it evidently suffices for Port to avoid being accused of political naivety or stupidity, even if this entails sacrificing the logical consistency of theoretical definitions, an attitude that may well be permissible for a critical feuilletonist, but is entirely incompatible with scholarly inquiry. Just how severely a reliance on Port's approach can backfire, particularly when undertaken without his polemical flair and without reflecting on the interventionist nature of his writing, has been starkly evident for well over a decade in the text of his epigons. The Diagnoses, rooted in the philosophy of identity, of a crisis in revolutionary theory, is now continued, albeit in a modified form, in the text of Stefan Breuer, in the text Die Krise der Revolutionstheorie of 1977, and Helmut Koenig, his book Geist und Revolution of 1981. Both critical theory and its belated adherent, Port, are to be recognized as critics of traditional Marxist revolutionary theory, inasmuch as they open themselves, in a manner constitutive of theory, to the experiences of the 20th century, quote, integration of the proletariat, quote, totalization of the exchange principle, quote, one-dimensionality of late capitalism, and, quote, the character of instrumental rationality as domination, quote, are identified as elements of a, quote, self-critique of historical materialism, quote, upon which one must build. However, the fact identified by Breuer, the analysis of the value form constitutes not a theory of revolution, but rather the concept of its impossibility, can only be substantiated beyond the premises of critical theory and its disciples, premises which remain themselves still beholden to the tradition of classical Marxism, specifically beyond their, quote, abandonment of central findings of value theory in favor of a, quote, historicist philosophy of subjectivity, Drawing on an elaborate manner upon the resources of the, quote, new Marx reading of the early 1970s, Breuer distinguishes himself from historicism in three distinct ways. The, quote, historicist problematic of the subject, cited here as the primary point, recurs to a critique of the field of, quote, metaphysics of labor, the structure of which is held to be present both in the economism of the Second and Third Internationals and in the humanism of Western Marxism. In these contexts, capitalism is critiqued from the standpoint of a concept of labor that is seen as already anticipating socialism in itself, and as being, at a subterranean level, fundamentally opposed to the principles of value. This labor is conceived on the one hand as the objective form of technology and labor process, and on the other as a, quote, species subject, lurking behind the reified identities of commodity and money, a subject that realizes its own inherent ends. Quote, both positions, observes Helmut Koenig, quote, coincide in the view that capitalism merely encases an intrinsically healthy core like a shell, indeed that it even creates the very climate and protection necessary for that core's full development, Helmut Koenig. However, anti-historicism also entails a methodological demarcation from the theory of simple commodity production and its offshoot, the practice of confining Marx's capital to the specific epoch of competitive capitalism. Ultimately, this also constitutes a rejection of historicism in the Popperian sense, that is, as a philosophy of history or an evolutionary theory positing progress through labor. At the same time, however, Breuer explicitly takes a stand against the, quote, tabooing of the question regarding the connection between Marxian theory and its, quote, forms of degeneration, unquote, Breuer. Yet while this theme is developed in Breuer's work in a somewhat scattered fashion, primarily through a detailed engagement with the work of Herbert Marcuse, it is systematically synthesized by Koenig and elaborated directly through an analysis of Marxian theory itself. Consequently, the following exposition will adhere primarily to Koenig's arguments, though it may also draw upon Breuer's theses where appropriate. Koenig's presentation of the theoretical constellation, which distinguishes Marx's, quote, early considerations on revolutionary theory from the revolutionary theoretical implications of the critique of political economy, unquote, offers nothing new compared to the writings examined thus far. What is decisive, rather, is a specific argumentative framing of the shift already diagnosed in detail by Kittsteiner from Marx's, or rather Feuerbach's, first demystification of Hegel via the, quote, method of inversion, unquote, where subject becomes predicate and vice versa, in the second demystification, which no longer reads Hegel as a theorist of the illusionary inverted formation process of the human species through labor, but instead deciphers his concept of Geist, spirit, as a description of capital that has become truly autonomous, according to Koenig, that's what I should say, I was saying Koenig, it's Koenig, the early Marx still espouses a quote, idealism of labor, end quote, or, as Breuer puts it, a quote, metaphysics of labor, end quote. He constructs a philosophy of history for the human species as the quote, universal, realizing itself through labor. A universal that, by passing through a process of alienation, ultimately overcomes the parochial particular interests of social classes and the fragmentation of capitalist modernity. At this stage, Marx allegedly lacks a quote, categorical apparatus, end quote, extending beyond that of classical economics, and instead engages in a subjectivist narrowing of the concept of capital, reducing it to the figure of the capitalist. Corresponding to this pre-critical and personalizing conception of capital is, quote, the notion of an unadulterated form of labor, standing entirely at the service of the human species, end quote, which is held to generate the material conditions for comprehensive emancipation. Labor thus still appears as an autonomous human act, one that is merely externally subjected to or becomes entangled in a dynamic of domination and exploitation, or is transformed into an objectivist variant of the metaphysics of labor, in which modern productive forces are hypostatized as the guarantors of human progress. Koenig, however, concedes a historical legitimacy to the subjectivist perspective. It was derived from the description of conditions in which value had not yet taken hold of the relations of production, and thus reflects the process of the primitive accumulation of capital, conceived as a violent history characterized by personal domination, of the separation of direct producers from their means of production, as well as the anti-capitalist external resistance against the impositions of the nascent mode of production. The emphasis on the volitional and creative power of a social class, the conception of the state as merely its executive committee, and the quote, idealism of labor, end quote, which views the act of production as the very constitution of the human species, can retain their validity only as long as the labor process has not yet become the valorization process of capital. That is, only as long as value has not yet subsumed labor's substance and foundation to itself. It is precisely this premise that underlies the concept of capital held by the pre-critical Marx, the logical locus of which is, therefore, to be situated, as it were, within the stage of a transition from money to capital that has not yet been fully consummated. According to Koenig, it is only in his late critique of economics-oriented works that Marx develops a concept of capital truly commensurate with its object. The, quote, early, activist revolutionary concept of capital, according to which the labor of producers and the will of capitalists constituted the central pillars of capitalism, end quote, is now supplanted by the realization of capital as a subjectless process, one that both subsumes the actors beneath itself and transforms the labor of the proletariat into an inherent moment of its own unfolding. Consequently, human beings and their activities lose their, quote, exterritorial status, end quote, vis-a-vis value precisely at the moment when external conditions are incorporated into the internal historicity of capital, its self-reproduction. Even at this juncture, Koenig describes capital in terms that could serve, and, as will be shown later, indeed do serve to remystify it. As a, quote, automatic subject, capital acquires the, quote, occult quality, end quote, of transforming all phenomena into moments of its, quote, own specific mode of articulation, end quote. It can thus be understood as the very reality of social formation, through the lens of a unified, self-identical principle that posits itself, quote, as the absolute, end quote. This stands in contrast to earlier modes of production in which society presented itself not as a unity, but rather as an ensemble fragmented into, quote, a multiplicity of relatively autonomous spheres existing side by side, end quote. Fundamentally, what is presented here as the adequate conceptualization of mature value-based social formation is precisely that model of, quote, expressive totality, end quote, for which Althusser famously reproached Marx, accusing him of, quote, bad Hegelianism, end quote, and, quote, economism, end quote. However, if it is not merely labor power that mutates into variable capital, but if capital in the course of real subsumption assimilates the objective world, quote, right down to the material dimension of the production process, end quote, then the question must be raised as to whether any revolutionary act can still be expected from a, quote, working class trained, united, and organized by the very mechanism of the capitalist production process itself, end quote. Marx, it is argued, still attempts to answer this question affirmatively in the book Capital, even though within that very work the conceptual model of a, quote, exterritorial substance, a, quote, Jesus Christ, let me repeat that sentence. Marx, it is argued, still attempts to answer this question affirmatively in the book Capital, even though within that very work the conceptual model of a, quote, exterritorial substance, end quote, untouched by value, had effectively been rendered untenable by the trajectory of his own argumentation. Following Koenig, Marx now places his hopes regarding the philosophy of history in, quote, living labor, specifically in the fact that a labor process, even when shaped by capital, remains fundamentally a labor process. In the interplay between human activity and the means and objects of labor, the preservative effect of labor becomes manifest by drawing upon the latent potentials of products from past labor processes, actualizing and, as it were, quote, enlivening them. It enables the very progress of material production. Thus, insofar as labor, by means of, quote, objectified labor, the means of labor acts upon, quote, objectified labor, end quote, the raw material, it ultimately relates only to itself within the production process, appearing in the dual forms of actuality and objectivity. This motif, it is argued, is modeled upon the Hegelian figure of the, quote, master craftsman found in the Phenomenology of Spirit. There, too, reference is made to the vanquishing of the work's transience through the enlivening activity of the artisan, and to the spirit's self-relation mediated through the object. However, whereas in Hegel this describes only a specific type of labor, the artisanal artistic, Marx ontologizes it into the defining characteristic of human labor per se. This becomes unmistakably evident in Marx's characterization of the labor process, a characterization, he claims, at the beginning of Chapter 5 of Volume 1 of the book Capital, to be valid, quote, independently of any specific social form, end quote. There it is asserted that the worker realizes, quote, his own self, end quote, as a, quote, there it is asserted that the worker realizes, quote, his own self, end quote, a, quote, purpose posited by himself, end quote. Consequently, even under capitalist conditions, Marx conceives of labor as a process in which the worker, quote, through the autonomous and systematic application of means, transforms the raw material of labor in accordance with an idea existing in his own mind, end quote. Thus, for Marx, the capitalist production process itself relies on the, quote, artistic and artisanal character, end quote, of labor. Within the enterprise, the separation between immediate producers and the means of production is effectively annulled once again, as living labor subordinates these means to itself, transforming instrument and material into the, quote, body of its soul, end quote. This stands in contrast to the situation, quote, in which labor is devoid of object, or exists as reality within the worker, solely in its immediate vitality, while the material of labor and the instrument exist as entities in themselves within capital, end quote. At the very center of the capitalist production process Amidst this tension between heteronomy and autonomy, private appropriation and social production, valorization and labor, there is thus reinstalled a contradiction of profound significance for revolutionary theory, that of two, quote, mutually independent totalities, unquote. It is here that the concept of a positive anticipation of the socialist mode of production within capitalism finds its foundation. The appropriation of the objective means of production by the immediate producers, labor acting as the, quote, dominant force, unquote, within the production process, thereby enables an ideal continuity amidst the discontinuity of historical modes of production. It is to this continuity that critique, conceived as, quote, determinate negation, and, quote, can anchor itself, and it can do so precisely because the figure of the, quote, master craftsman, and, quote, can anchor itself, and it can do so precisely because the figure of the, quote, master craftsman, and, quote, the agent who wields technology as an instrument, is no longer the individual worker, but rather the collective subjectivities of the, quote, working class, or, quote, humanity, end quote. As Breuer observes, this collective subject is one that, quote, standing beyond all the constraints of the valorization process generates, through its engagement with nature, that universal rationality, which will ultimately and necessarily shatter the particular forms into which it has been compressed by capitalism, end quote. Where the hell am I? Although Koenig and Breuer do indeed identify here a potent motif of the ontology of labor within Marxism, the legitimacy of their line of argument can nonetheless be contested on several points. This applies above all to their interpretation of the passage concerning the labor process in the 5th chapter of Marx's Capital. For that passage makes no mention of any autonomous setting of ends, let alone any mastery of the labor process. Rather, it is Koenig himself who transforms the elements highlighted by Marx, namely the mediation of consciousness and the purposiveness inherent in all labor processes, from a neutral anthropological description into a normatively charged principle. After all, even in the most heteronymous labor process, quote, human activity by means of the instrument of labor affects a change in the object of labor that is intended from the outset, end quote. Even if that purpose was not devised by the worker himself, even if he has been reduced to a, quote, mere force of nature, end quote, and even if he performs purely mindless tasks. In the very paragraph cited by Koenig, Marx himself begins by stating that the worker subordinates his will to the purpose that determines the manner in which he acts. In the subsequent passage, which Koenig fails to cite, Marx explicitly emphasizes that this subordination of the will to the purpose is required all the more, quote, the less the work, by its own content and the manner of its execution, draws the worker along with it, the less, therefore, he enjoys it as the play of his own physical and mental powers, end quote. This hardly sounds like labor as a means of self-valorization or as an affirmation of one's own autonomy. Throughout this entire section, however, Marx consciously operates with the abstraction of, quote, the worker, examining his activity in terms of its, quote, simple and abstract moments, end quote, in order to demonstrate that the considerations at hand transcend specific social formations. To conclude from this that he reduces certain specific forms of the labor process strictly to a solitary artistic mode of activity is to ignore the various levels of abstraction inherent in his argumentation. Moreover, the metaphor-rich characterization of the work process as the actualization, preservation, and realization of the use-value potentials of products of past labor by no means points to a professional profile akin to that of a master craftsman. Rather, it merely demonstrates that all production is independent upon it merely demonstrates that all production is dependent upon human activity in its actual form. In this context, Breuer's use of the term, quote, living labor, also casts a revealing light on the vitalistic normative charge attributed to Marxian categories. First, a statement by Marx is cited in which the transformation of workers' operations into mechanical movements is emphasized as a prerequisite for the emergence of machinery. This is followed by Breuer's conclusion that this constitutes a clear indication of the fact, quote, that machinery is not the result of living labor, but rather of a, quote, specific mode of working, end quote, namely labor that has already become abstract, end quote. For Breuer, therefore, living labor is regarded as a specific type of work, artisanal, skilled labor, dependent on the dexterity of the practitioner. Marx, however, employs this term neutrally as a simple reference to the actual expenditure of labor power. Labor as a process performed by human beings, in contrast to labor objectified in products, or labor as a mere potentiality residing within labor power. Thus, for Marx, both de-skilled and skilled labor fall under the category of, quote, living labor, end quote. For, quote, reconstructive purposes, Koenig now also arbitrarily reassembles various quotations drawn from this justificatory context. In order to demonstrate the alleged shift in Marx's argumentation regarding the unity of the labor process, he cites the notion of a, quote, transmigration of souls, end quote. Yet Marx employs this very concept precisely within the context that Koenig erroneously characterized as, quote, metaphysical of labor, end quote. Marx describes how the value of the means of production utilized in the labor process is successively, quote, transferred to the new products. The attribute of expending useful labor, while simultaneously being compelled to employ products of objectified labor as means of production, which under capitalism manifests as the capacity to create value only by preserving the value of the means of production, appears to him as a, quote, natural gift of living labor, end quote. This functional nexus, the, quote, transmigration of souls, end quote, of the value of the means of production, is also systematically presupposed within the process of producing relative surplus value, the very basis for the genesis and perpetual revolutionization of large-scale industry. This, quote, animation of objects by living labor, therefore, in no way contradicts that, quote, transmigration of souls, end quote, of value. Rather, it reveals itself to be its very condition. For Koenig, the notion of the, quote, transmigration of souls serves to indicate that living labor, acting as the, quote, animating force of the production process, quote, migrates into the machine in the course of the real subsumption of the labor process under capital. This denotes a state of affairs of an entirely different nature. Whereas in the formally subsumed labor process of the manufacture system, the use of the instrument still went hand in hand with the virtuosity and dexterity of the worker. Within large-scale industry, quote, all the powers of the master craftsman have passed over to the machine, end quote. Here indeed, the, quote, socialism thesis, end quote, of traditional Marxism is thoroughly dismantled. Marx characterizes industrialization as a process in which capital, through machinery, the form of labor organization accompanying it, and certain infrastructural phenomena, quote, gives itself its adequate form of as use value within the production process, end quote. While in the production process that is merely formally subordinated to the valorization process, and still organized along artisanal lines, quote, labor still transcended the process of the unity of dominating, quote, labor still transcended the process as the unity dominating it, end quote. A machinery, quote, objectified labor confronts living labor within the labor process itself as the dominating power, a power which capital in its formal aspect essentially is, the appropriation of living labor, end quote. What capital represents is an alien power, dominating the purposes of the worker, as well as those of the capitalist, acting as it were as a quote, acting as it were as an automatic subject, and as an autonomous social nexus of the labors performed within privately isolated production units, is precisely what machinery represents as an quote automatic system, a moving force that moves itself, end quote. Machinery is no longer defined, quote, as a means of labor for the individual worker, end quote, nor is production any longer dependent on the, quote, immediate dexterity of the worker, end quote. Rather, it constitutes a, quote, technological application of science, end quote, which in turn exists as something autonomous and specialized vis-a-vis the manual workers, meaning that it resides, quote, not in the consciousness of the worker, but acts upon the worker through the machine as an alien power, end quote. Living labor is thereby transformed into, quote, a mere living appendage of this machinery, as a means of its action, end quote. And the inversion of subject and object is thereby consummated even within the immediate production process. Neither, quote, is the worker the animating force and the center organizing the production processes, nor are the objective conditions of production his objectifications, from which he is separated merely by a title of ownership, end quote, observes Koenig. Further, the socialization of labor within the immediate production process does not constitute an autonomous achievement of the workers themselves. Rather, it is a result of capital, a, quote, abstract socialization, end quote, that through the very act of bringing the workers together, simultaneously strips the workers of their organizational, cognitive, and productive autonomy. Quote, capital aggregates them into a class while simultaneously preventing them from constituting themselves as such, end quote. According to Breuer, the capitalist mode of production thus renders the universal development of the individual impossible, causing workers to, quote, lose all connection to the products they create, end quote, and deprives them of their, quote, use value forming and thereby experience constituting qualities, end quote. By fragmenting their formerly undivided competencies into countless partial competencies, hollowed out forms of movement, and cognitive operations that exist separately in the guise of science. Koenig and Breuer, however, derive from this justified critique of the, quote, ontology of labor, end quote, within traditional Marxism, as well as from the observation that Marx's famous chapter 24.7 of Capital contains a philosophy of history position that remains unmediated by the insights of his critique of political economy. Their, quote, insight into the impossibility of revolutionary critique, end quote. Yet, as demonstrated by their normative reinterpretation of the discourse regarding the, quote, animating force, end quote, of labor, specifically its consciousness-mediated and teleological fundamental structure, this approach relies on patterns of argumentation rooted in a philosophy of historical decline that are, in fact, external to Marx's own critique of political economy. This tendency becomes even more radicalized in the final line of argumentation regarding the crisis of revolutionary theory. Furthermore, the ambivalence is inherent in the process of industrialization, which Marx himself emphasizes are simply ignored. This includes, for instance, the fact that with automation, the worker steps, quote, alongside the production process, end quote, rather than remaining, quote, its principal agent, end quote. That he thus relates to the production process, quote, as a watchman and regulator, end quote, and that this situation harbors an immense emancipatory potential, even if the specific form of machinery generated by capital contains this potential only in potentia. Instead, the realization that the capitalist form as analyzed in Marx's reflections on, quote, real subsumption, cannot be critiqued solely from the standpoint of the factual production process. That the, quote, socialism of labor, end quote, mobilizes a counterforce against the, quote, anarchy of capital, end quote, merely leads one deeper into the very object one seeks to critique. That the labor process constitutes an abstractly socialized terrain dominated by an autonomous technostructure that subordinates the worker, de-skills him, and renders him, quote, devoid of experience, end quote. And that any seemingly immediate counter-principle to the law of value is, in reality, already seized and mediated by that very law. All these insights are dramatically transmuted into the thesis that any form of social critique is now, quote, burnt out, end quote. In doing so, much as in Port's work, the logical contradiction inherent in a historically induced identity between the material and formal dimensions is accepted in order to lend a, quote, value theoretical, end quote, foundation to one's own diagnosis of the crisis. Thus, Breuer observes that, quote, the, quote, reification of the determinations of production, end quote, characteristic of capitalism, was not to be understood merely metaphorically, but actually signified that the specific social form of labor coincided with its material existence. That form and content were, in other words, identical, end quote. It is no wonder that a critique of fetishism plays no role whatsoever in the entire body of work produced by Breuer and Koenig. For these two authors, so to speak, fall prey to the mystifications of capital with their eyes wide open, whereas Marx consistently emphasized that he had thereby uncovered the very origin of bourgeois ideology. While Marx, despite his comprehensive diagnosis of a mode of existence for the labor process that is fully adequate to capital, still manages to distinguish between machinery as a material complex and its social form as capital, even if the notion of the capitalist application of machinery is, strictly speaking, inadequate. For Breuer and Koenig, every machine apparently becomes capital per se. The remystification of the concept of capital constitutes a necessary element of this approach. As is noted at the outset, Koenig adopts without commentary Marx's categories regarding the, quote, occult quality, end quote, of capital as a, quote, automatic subject, end quote, drawn from Chapter 4 of Volume 1, treating them as a positive characterization. In reality, however, this, quote, occult quality, end quote, the capacity, quote, to create value because it is value, end quote, serves as the precise characterization of the capital fetish, or interest-bearing capital fetish, wherein value appears in a distorted guise as a form devoid of mediation, a distortion that implies the logical contradiction, quote, whereby 4 equals 5, end quote. The correct insistence on the fact that capital and value do not represent a form of personal domination disguised as objective necessity, but rather a real abstract socialization mediated through a social relation between things, mutates here into a fetishistic interpretation of the social form as it exists in objective guise. However, reification in the first sense must be sharply distinguished from reification in the second. The former denotes a real relation, one whose structural nature was in fact largely missed even by Western Marxism, which Heinz-Dieter Kitzsteiner describes as follows, quote, while producers do indeed stand behind the commodities, they do not constitute a society independent of those commodities. Rather, they come together to form the total social labor only by means of their products. Behind the relation of 20 yards of linen to one coat, there does not lurk some additional, quote, human relation. Rather, their social relation is precisely this relation between things, and no other. Reification here signifies merely that the reflection of this relationship solidifies into a, quote, thing-like quality, within the commodity that occupies the equivalent form, end quote. Or more precisely, that it is socially validly represented by the equivalent commodity. On this basis, the illusion arises that value is an inherent property of things. Consequently, neither is the implicit assertion correct that, quote, capitalism rests on a relationship between things rather than between persons, end quote. Nor does capital, in the process of its self-reproduction, posit itself, quote, as an absolute, end quote. Nor does it constitute a subject capable of laying golden eggs without the mediation of a production relation. As is the case with Port, Koenig's assertion of a bourgeoisie, quote, rendered superfluous, end quote, by capital betrays, at the very least, a conflation of the historical guise of the capital owner with the form constitutive function of the capitalist. One must ask here to what extent Marx's discourse regarding the, quote, autonomous material conditions of production, end quote, is to be understood metaphorically, and to what extent it is to be taken literally. Things themselves, in the guise of the capitalist industrial machine complex, can never truly become autonomous vis-a-vis the collective worker. Yet they can very well do so vis-a-vis the individual worker. The conceptual reduction of value to its foundation, the capitalist production relation, is ultimately interpreted by Breuer and Koenig through the lens of a history of decline, as the end of a formerly existing, quote, two-dimensionality of bourgeois society, end quote, and is understood as the sublation of the opposition between, quote, abstractive semblance, end quote, and, quote, productive foundation, end quote. With justification, this terminology, equating, quote, semblance with value/value form and, quote, foundation / quote, essence with production is supposed to possess remains Breuer's secret. Where he becomes more concrete, his interpretations are simply erroneous or unclear. For instance, when he characterizes the value form as the mode of appearance of commodity A's value within the use value of commodity B as mere, quote, semblance. The fact that such misleading terminology has become established within the tradition of critical theory seems to suffice. Likewise, the interpretation of use value. Okay. The interpretation of use value as the, quote, stand-in for the non-identical, end quote, whose system transcending power is said to have gradually dried up in the wake of the consolidation of the capitalist mode of production, remains a legacy of critical theory that is yet to be rigorously substantiated through a critique of political economy. The motif of historical decline and the historicization of the mode of representation of capital plays a central role, above all, in the depiction of the third and the final constellation of contradictions emanated. The motif of historical decline and the historicization of the mode of representation of capital plays a central role, above all, in the depiction of the third and final constellation of contradictions eliminated by capital. As a reminder, according to Koenig, there exist three constellations embodying the opposition between value and use value. He identifies the first contradiction dynamic of significance for revolutionary theory in the assertion of capital against the traditional modes of production and life of feudal and artisanal direct producers. He sees the second as grounded in the opposition between formally subsumed labor, or the working class, and the form of capital, an opposition that vanishes with the real subsumption of the production process. The third transient contradictory structure between exchange value and use value, it is argued, takes the form of the opposition between value-determined production and use value-determined consumption, or alternatively, circulation. According to Marx, capital initially encounters its limit within the sphere of circulation, specifically insofar as that circulation is directed toward consumptive needs. The quote, generic subject, end quote, thereby ostensibly finds refuge in the sphere of the exchange process. In times of crisis, the power of this subject is, as it were, demonstrated by its capacity to thwart the boundless tendency of capital valorization through the mechanism of limited aggregate consumption, thereby ensuring that, quote, use value itself plays a role as an economic category, end quote. In this context, however, Koenig advances the rather audacious claim that Marx thereby conceives of crises, quote, as the result of a conscious intervention by needy subjects, as proof of the rationality of capitalism, and as a harbinger of socialism, end quote. While it cannot be denied that in the Grundrisse Marx indeed posited a closer link between economic crisis and the ultimate collapse of production based on value, the mode of argumentation employed here does not, even in this instance, proceed from the premise of autonomous subjects and their needs. Rather, While it cannot be denied that in the Grundrisse, Marx indeed posited a closer link between economic crisis and the ultimate collapse of production based on value, the mode of argumentation employed here does not, even in this instance, proceed from the premise of autonomous subjects and their needs, subjects who consciously impose limits upon capital from within the sphere of consumption. Rather, drawing upon underconsumptionist theory, it derives the inherent limitations of the working class's effective demand, as well as from the capital-immanent intensification of productive forces and the concomitant, albeit merely putative, quote, erosion of value substance. However, even according to Marx, the opposition between value and use value loses its relevance for revolutionary theory. This occurs in accordance with the peculiar logic of capital, which integrates its own preconditions into the process of its reproduction, thereby constituting them as its own specific determinations. This loss of relevance stems from the fact that the sphere of consumption and the human structure of needs are themselves subsumed under capital. Consumption, Marx observes, is expanded through, quote, firstly, quantitative expansion of existing consumption, secondly, the creation of new needs by propagating existing ones within a wider circle, thirdly, the production of new needs and the discovery and creation of new use values, end quote. This insight, already formulated by Marx regarding the production of a subject for the object of production, has subsequently been examined in exhaustive detail by critical theory with respect to its implications for revolutionary theory. In this context, Koenig and Breuer do not interpret the critical theorist's theorem regarding the, quote, liquidation of the sphere of circulation, end quote, in the politicist sense of a negatively inverted, quote, state capitalism, a charge they rightly level against Horkheimer and Port. Rather, it is not the substitution of the laws of capitalist socialization by some extra economic force, but rather the, quote, totalization of value arising from its own movement, end quote, and occurring within its own inherent limits, that brings about a, quote, liquidation of the autonomy of circulation and consumption, end quote. This means that within a society governed by the, quote, exchange principle, use value loses its system-transcending potential. While not literally speaking, quote, sublated, it is nonetheless reduced to a mere moment of capital reproduction. Consequently, together with its inherent dimension of subjective sensual need, it can no longer serve as a fulcrum for a critique of value-form totality. Pleasure and power, as Koenig argues with reference to Foucault, are no longer opposites, but must instead be understood as a relationship of mutual constitution. Quote, capitalism does not violate needs, nor does capitalism restrict or repress needs. On the contrary, capitalism creates, liberates, and unleashes needs. As in the case of production, however, Marx allegedly attempts to derive a positive consequence for revolutionary theory even from this process, namely by locating the unconscious civilizing tendency of capital in the creation of a human being who is, quote, rich in needs precisely because, bracket, he is, in bracket, rich in attributes and relationships, end quote. Whether Marx thereby implies, as Koenig suggests, that this human being, while still within capitalism, has already transcended it, remains a matter of doubt. Yet Koenig is unable to discern any positive aspect in this diversification and quantification of needs, driven as it is by the internal laws governing the accumulation of abstract exchange values, for the simple reason that neither production nor circulation under capitalism exhibits, quote, even a partial autonomous grounding in the logic of use value, end quote. However, Marx neither asserted this, nor does the counter-argument imply that capitalism produces nothing but trash. In any case, the concept of the crisis as a critical consumer veto against nonsensical use values, a notion here imputed to Marx, must be regarded as an invention entirely unique to Helmut Koenig. Crises, however, do, quote, not have as their cause the power of a subject with needs, one that ceases to purchase those products which possess absolutely no use value, or at most merely suggest one. Rather, they occur even if one assumes that a genuine need exists for all commodities without exception, end quote. Not even in the passages of the Grundrisse dealing with underconsumption theory is a different assertion to be found. With regard to the position taken by Breuer and Koenig, it must ultimately be noted that, while they indeed reject the historicizing interpretation of capital as a theory of competitive capitalism, and are already informed by the findings of the, quote, state derivation debate, end quote, in their rejection of the state capitalism thesis, their own version of the history of the decline of use value nevertheless relies on a historicization of the order of exposition in capital. This approach, quote, elevates the theorem of the, quote, two-dimensionality of critical theory, end quote, to the status of historical truth regarding the genesis of capitalism, and retrojects its own metaphysics of labor, along with its fetishism of use value, back into Marxian theory, end quote. For broadly speaking, Breuer and Koenig view Marx's Capital as a depiction of a fateful historical process of subsumption between value and use value, a process in which, as has been shown, various normative determinations are imputed to the material dimension and to early capitalist conditions, only to be subsequently diagnosed as obsolete within the context of mature capitalism. The diagnosis of a crisis in revolutionary theory, initiated by Wolfgang Port and continued by Stefan Breuer and Helmut Koenig, thus exhibits the following motifs. The diagnosis of the one-dimensionalization of capitalism. There is no longer any, quote, outside of the system constitutive of social critique. The proletariat, the production process, and consumption patterns have been assimilated into the principle of capitalism, the production of value, and thus lose their utopian rational surplus. This implies above all a critique of the metaphysics of labor, according to which capitalism can be criticized from the standpoint of a form of labor that already anticipates socialism within itself, and is subterraneously opposed to the principles of value. A form of labor conceived as one moment as the objective configuration of technology and the labor process, and at another as a species subject lurking behind the reified entities of commodity and money, realizing its own ends. Thus, these crisis diagnoses operate on two central premises. One, the thesis of externality. That critique is possible only from the standpoint of a position not constituted by capital. 2. The thesis of decline. That critique was accordingly once possible at the inception of capitalism, when the latter was still evolving toward totality and preparing to subordinate to itself all social fields, objects, and needs not constituted by itself, transforming them into elements of its own self-reproduction. Since the thesis of decline is to be substantiated using the categories of the critique of political economy, these categories must themselves first be normatively charged and subsequently arranged in a historical sequence of decline. Whether, as in the case of Port, with, or as with Breuer and Koenig, without, echoes of the state monopoly capitalism theory, Stamocap theory. The crisis diagnosis offered by these authors ultimately amount to a mere revaluation of Marx's ambiguous diagnosis regarding the, quote, abolition of the capitalist mode of production within the capitalist mode of production itself, unquote. The tendencies that appeared to Marx, even in contradiction to the scientific content of his own enterprise, as a, quote, point of transition to a new form of production, unquote, are regarded by these authors as indices of a transformation, specifically a transformation from rule mediated through circulation into rule mediated directly through violence, Port, or in an, quote, insubstantialization, end quote, of those categories of economic critique that denote material substance, Breuer Koenig, In this process, the arguments oscillate between entirely apt observations regarding the repressive character of production and consumption, processes subsumed under capital, and a philosophical concept of identity regarding the, quote, development of value, end quote, a concept that is either theoretically presupposed from the outset, Port, or ultimately surreptitiously smuggled in via a historical narrative of decline, Breuer/Koenig. Sorry, let me repeat that sentence. In this process, the arguments oscillate between entirely apt observations regarding the repressive character of production and consumption processes subsumed under capital, and a philosophical concept of identity regarding the, quote, development of value, end quote, a concept that is either theoretically presupposed from the outset, Port, or ultimately surreptitiously smuggled in via a historical narrative of decline, Breuer/Koenig, Under this concept, value is conceived either as a substance subject, unfolding itself through differentiation, thereby echoing the early intuitions of Hans-Georg Bachhaus, or as a force that at the, quote, end of history, end quote, succeeds in assimilating all non-identical external matter, rendering it identical with itself. However, rather than falling for these diagnosticians as the custodians of a negative absolute knowledge, they should instead be understood as the ideological interpreters of capital fetishism. Stefan Breuer has demonstrated with commendable clarity that the crisis diagnoses cited thus far signify for the project of transformative social practice. theory, he argues, must, quote, come to terms with the fact that political action is possible only on the terrain of and by means of capitalist society. It must recognize that, quote, transcendence, unquote, is no longer possible in any way other than ideologically. Yet that a merely ideological act of transcendence, should it translate into political practice, is liable to diminish the scope for action that still or already exists within capitalist society, unquote. Here one is left to wonder whence suddenly do these, quote, scopes for action, unquote, within capitalism, which had only moments before been denied in the manner of a total dismissal, supposedly originate. Conversely, it also remains Breuer's secret how it is conceivable that the determinations of bourgeois individuality, which acquire social relevance only through the universalization of circulation, i.e. the genesis of industrial capital, could claim social validity only prior to that very process. Indeed, the chronological markers for the entry into this, quote, one-dimensional society, unquote, vary considerably among the various proponents of this diagnosis. While Breuer and Koenig cite at different points the 18th century, the onset of capital self-reproduction, and finally the process of, quote, real subsumption, unquote. Port offers a different date, the crisis year of 1873, and subsequently asserts that the final phase of a, quote, total socialization, unquote, was reached only after the failure of the student revolt of 1968. Port, Breuer, and Koenig do indeed refute the classical Marxist theory of revolution, which posits the industrial production process as the proxy for communism. Yet by declaring any fundamental social upheaval to be impossible in principle, through their refutation of Marxist revolutionary theory, they remain negatively bound to traditional Marxism. Moyche-Pistone takes a very different approach. I don't know why I said very. Moyche-Pistone takes a different approach to critiquing the metaphysics of labor and its implications for revolutionary theory. As early as 1976, in a text co-authored with Helmut Reinecke, the fundamental contours of Pistone's comprehensive work, Time, Labor, and Social Domination, were already discernible. Value, Pistone argued, must, quote, not be viewed as a simple market category, unquote. Contrary to industrial and labor ontological positions, this argument serves to highlight the process of real subsumption and its consequences for both the labor process and its products. The increasing de-skilling and one-sidedness of labor, the radical separation of mental and manual labor, and the despotism of the factory regime. It is asserted that under industrial capitalism it is not merely the purpose or application of machinery that is form-determined, but the machinery itself. Nevertheless, any claim asserting an identity between the formal and material dimension is explicitly rejected. The focus rather lies on the, quote, form-determined, yet not entirely subsumed within this form determination, use value, end quote. The, quote, use value dimension characterizes a non-identical moment, end quote, the substantive emancipatory potential of which is increasingly unleashed in the course of the capitalist dynamic of relative surplus value production and real subsumption, meaning it is not lost, as Port and Breuer presume. Consequently, the material dimension, which entails the potential for a reduction in working time through increased productivity, enters into a contradiction with the formal dimension, which continues to rest upon the utilization of, quote, direct human labor, end quote, though precisely what constitutes, quote, direct remains unclear, a contradiction that Marx had already addressed in the Grundrisse. According to Pistone, the system transcending contradiction, therefore, does not lie between, as Marxists often mistakenly understand them, productive forces and relations of production. Rather, it lies between a potential of the productive forces generated in the course of capitalist development a potential for increased productivity, for the abolition of the division between mental and manual labor, for the elimination of despotism of the factory regime, etc., and the actual mode of production as a whole, understood as capitalist relations of production and productive forces shaped by the capitalist form. Furthermore, immanent critique, conceived as a juxtaposition of bourgeois ideals and capitalist reality, is rejected at this very juncture, based on the argument that these ideals are intrinsically interwoven with capitalist forms of wealth. Bourgeois ideals, it is argued, are not merely, quote, distorted by the rule of the bourgeoisie. Rather, they are to be derived from the commodity form itself, both in their positive aspect, which fosters revolt, and in their negative aspect, which serves to stabilize the system. Finally, Postone summarizes critique by rejecting any labor ontological conception of alienation, a conception that critiques capitalism from the standpoint of what is here termed, quote, proletarian labor, end quote, and later, quote, labor under capitalism, end quote. An emancipatory goal, by contrast, must articulate itself through the program of the, quote, self-abolition of class, end quote, and of the labor associated with it. Postone formulates his critique of the traditional Marxist rejection of indirect socialization from the standpoint of direct socialization. Postone formulates his critique of the traditional Marxist rejection of indirect socialization from the standpoint of direct socialization, that is, in a form distinct from that of Port, Breuer, and Koenig. Like them, Postone initially refers to the contrast established in that context between a division of labor within the enterprise, conceived as form indifferent, and a societal division of labor conceived as anarchic capitalist. A distinction which, in the final analysis, is seen to culminate, both organizationally and ethically, in the dichotomy of collectivism and individualism. According to Postone, neither the forms of collectivity manifested in the class struggle, nor the dimension of labor organization within the valorization process constitute a movement that transcends the system. Collective forms of practice and law established in the course of the class struggle merely serve to constitute the individual's worker's function as a commodity owner, for it is only through collectively organized resistance against the valorization interest of individual capitals that the value of labor power is actually realized within the exchange relation. Postone observes that the status of owning the commodity labor power, quote, can be fully realized only in a collective form, end quote, and that workers therefore, quote, can be, quote, bourgeois subjects, end quote, only collectively, end quote. Finally, the process of the real subsumption of the labor process under capital is identified as the, quote, material concretization, end quote, of the value dimension, premised, however, on the fundamental non-identity of these two spheres, yet without recourse to arguments based on a philosophy of identity or a descent into apocalyptic rhetoric. His concept of value socialization as a, quote, Postone's concept of value socialization as a homogeneous totality. A homogeneous totality is consistently counterbalanced by a consideration of the material dimension as an irreducibly heterogeneous whole. The relationship between productive forces and relations of production thus become discernible as a, quote, dialectics of two dimensions of capital, unquote, rendering questionable the assumption that the industrial production process possesses a, quote, exterritorial, end quote, status. That is, that it constitutes a concrete anticipation of a socialist planned form of socialization. Consequently, a transcending contradiction can, in this view, be posited only between the actuality and the potentiality of the mode of production itself. According to Paston, Marx's critique is grounded in this, and not in actually existing configurations of productive forces. It constitutes a, quote, negatively immanent, end quote, critique, in contrast to a, quote, positively immanent, end quote, critique, end quote, which critiques the existing order on the basis of something else that also exists, end quote. Oh shit, I fucked that up. According to Paston, Marx's critique is grounded in this, and not in actually existing configurations of productive forces. It constitutes a, quote, negatively immanent, end quote, critique, in contrast to a positively immanent one, quote, which critiques the existing order on the basis of something else that also exists, end quote, and thus anchors itself in a specific moment of the capitalist social formation, be it the planned yet, quote, collectivistically despotic, end quote, character of the factory regime, the ostensibly universal class interest of the proletariat, or the bourgeois ideals of simple circulation, and from that vantage point is something supposedly not determined by capitalist form, negates the other moments. Such a critique may rightly be characterized, following Paston, as, quote, bourgeois in a non-sociologically reductive sense, end quote, one that implies a, quote, vision of socialism, end quote, which, quote, signifies the realization of the essence of capitalist society, end quote. One second, sorry. Come on. Paston's conceptual framework opens up the possibility of identifying system-transcending potentials without falling into the dead end of, quote, labor ontological, end quote, positions. However, it remains limited to pointing out objective possibilities. How an awareness of these possibilities is developed on the side of the subject is not addressed. Yet this should not be regarded as a shortcoming, but rather as a mark of scholarly integrity. Nevertheless, several points central to Paston's argumentation warrant critical scrutiny. To begin with, this critique of the supposedly traditional Marxist juxtaposition of direct and indirect socialization does not seem entirely convincing. By way of preface, a brief note on how these concepts are conventionally employed in neo-Marxist discourse. Direct socialization of labor implies that human labor is recognized a priori as an integral part of total social labor because the actors involved stand within a direct context of domination or communication, mediated by force, norms, language, etc. Indirect socialization of labor, as it occurs under capitalism, implies that the social nexus is prior to the actors in such a way that it defines their labor as privately isolated exertion. Consequently, these individuals, constituted as private producers, enter into a perpetually precarious social relationship with one another, only retrospectively, or, quote, indirectly, through the medium of their labor products, specifically commodities as distinctively social objects. The value of labor products, constituted under such conditions of labor socialization, characterized by a private division of labor, emerges as the autonomous medium of social synthesis. Its substance is abstract labor, the form of unity among disparate labors under the specific condition of their systematic dissociation. Regarding the definitions of abstract labor and value as forms of indirect socialization found in the works of Vygotsky, Mandel, and Sweezy, Postone argues that value is thereby reduced to a mere, quote, category of market-mediated distribution, end quote. Furthermore, he suggests that the traditional Marxist determination of value can be deciphered as a critique of indirect socialization undertaken from the standpoint of direct socialization. From this perspective, socialism is to be understood as the sublation of mediated forms of socialization through the establishment of a directly social character of labor. In reality, however, according to Marx, the opposition between privately isolated labor and immediately social labor constitutes a relationship of reciprocal conditioning and mutual complementarity. While the conventional interpretation claims that labor is, quote, directly social in all societies except the capitalist one, unquote, for Marx, labor possesses a directly social dimension only within capitalism. The standpoint of Marx's critique is therefore the very object of Marx's own critique. What the former still seeks to realize is an emancipatory promise, the latter already regards the actual calamity of an alienated socialization. However, if one examines the definitions cited by Postone more closely, his claims at this level of exposition simply fail to appear plausible, indeed through his indiscriminate use of the term, quote, labor. Postone actually conflates concrete labor along with labor's social dimension. I'm going to repeat that. Postone actually conflates concrete labor along with its social dimension with the specifically social form that concrete labor assumes within production relations characterized by a private division of labor, and he then proceeds to impute this very confusion to the opposing positions. For instance, when Vygotsky states, quote, although, like all labor, it is social, under conditions of private ownership of the means of production, it nevertheless does not bear a directly social character, end quote. He is merely pointing out that within the capitalist mode of production, concrete labor is not a priori a constituent element of total social labor. Rather, it must first validate itself as such by assuming an abstract form, whereby its product is ultimately exchanged for money. And I feel like the one thing that's right there in that quote, right, just says directly does not bear a directly social character. That's not saying that it's asocial. That's just saying it's not directly social, right? It does have commodity producing production processes have a social orientation, right? Their production is for sale. It is for society. It's seeking to be socially validated. It is just not necessarily validated. It's not guaranteed. There's no guarantee of there's no guarantee that the labor undertaken privately will be validated via exchange. There could be waste that does not pass that threshold of validation, so that I feel like that's the whole thing. I feel like it's such a fucking tedious, annoying conversation to be having. When people talk about this, is just kind of like a theme that's throughout these, like, anything you talk about value form and the critiques of it. When people say, "Oh, is value," the idea that emphasizing that labor must be ex post validated via sales, or like the value can only be proven to exist via sales, means the characterization of that approach is like circulationist or something like that. It's such a tedious conversation. This kind of like bifurcation is like is something of productionist or circulationist. It's a very tedious argument, a tedious conversation, I find, because it seems so blatantly obvious to me that, of course, capitalist commodity production is oriented towards production, but it's very obvious to me that is oriented towards sales, oriented towards the market, oriented towards buying and selling, and the sheer fact, but that does not mean that it is directly social, right? And it could fail socially. It could be a failure. Capitalist production, privately undertaken production, can fail to achieve what it seeks, which is the acquisition of money via the sale of a commodity. That very fact, that it could fail, indicates to me that its production, the production of a commodity, is indirectly social, and if it fails to validate itself through sale, it could as well said to have not existed at all. Or it only remained a latent possibility. That seems so fundamental to me that I don't know how anyone could dispute it. Anyway, sorry, I'm going to repeat a couple sentences because I was yammering. For instance, when Vygotsky states, quote, although like all labor it is social, under conditions of private ownership of the means of production, it nevertheless does not bear a directly social character, end quote. Vygotsky is merely pointing out that, within the capitalist mode of production, concrete labor is not a priori a constituent element of total social labor. Rather, it must first validate itself as such by assuming an abstract form, whereby its product is ultimately exchanged for money. Pistone, however, without being able to substantiate this with citations, presupposes that Vygotsky et al. Mean that, quote, labor merely, quote, appears to be private, while in reality, by its very nature, so to speak, it is social. Yet to assert the social character of concrete labor is not to ascribe to it the function of social mediation, a function it possesses only as abstract labor within capitalism. Nor is it in fact to make any claim whatsoever regarding the specific mode of labor socialization. Rather, it merely signifies that, quote, certain useful labors must satisfy a specific social need, and thus prove themselves as components of total labor, of the spontaneous system of the social division of labor, end quote. Meaning that, in societies characterized by a division of labor, production is invariably undertaken to meet a social need, a point Pistone himself acknowledges elsewhere when he observes that concrete, quote, labor possesses a social character in all social formations, end quote. However, this statement reveals nothing regarding the specific form of socialization that these concrete labors undergo. Consequently, in the context of capitalism, Marx speaks of the, quote, doubly social character, end quote, of labor, inasmuch as it acquires an additional social dimension within that system. In sum, Pistone thus imputes to Vygotsky a conflation of the social character of concrete labor with the direct sociality of labor, and simultaneously a misunderstanding thereof, given that concrete labor supposedly exhibits such a synthesizing quality only under capitalism, in its guise as abstract labor. Beyond this misinterpretation, Pistone merely replaces the term, quote, direct socialization with that of the, quote, manifest or, quote, transparent social mediation of concrete labor via norms, physical coercion, conscious decisions, etc. Consequently, quote, direct or, quote, immediate socialization cannot be taken to signify the, quote, abolition of mediation tout court, end quote. Moreover, what might lie behind such a concept of non-mediation remains unclear and undeveloped, as is the case with so much else in this book. On the one hand, Pastone rightly observes that social, quote, interdependence is always mediated, end quote, that anything else is unthinkable. On the other hand, he associates this concept with statist and communitarian positions. To the abolition of which specific media, then, is the model constructed and subsequently rejected by Pastone supposed to refer? Is it meant to signify only institutional forms of mediation, such as representative bodies or democratic processes of opinion formation, or even, as bourgeois critics falsely impute to Marx, every form of coping with natural constraints, or indeed even objective forms of mediation per se? A further point of criticism concerns Pastone's claim to demonstrate the partial decoupling of the concept of value from private property in the market, as well as its anchoring within the immediate production process. This claim is not substantiated. Pastone is indeed correct when, in summarizing his tracing of the process of real subsumption, he asserts that value is the, quote, structuring principle of both forms of the division of labor in capitalist society. Here it structures not only the social division of labor, but also the division of labor within the workshops, end quote. The despotic planning, the subsumption of the worker under combined labor processes and the machine system, and its transformation, quote, into the automatic driving mechanism of a partial operation, end quote, would be understood by Marx as the results of the, quote, anarchic and antagonistically individualistic process of socialization mediated by value. The despotic, externally determined form of association found there is the direct result of the market-mediated dissociation of individuals, or production units, found here. Collectivist subsumption and individualistic liberation must thus be understood in their dialectical intertwinement. However, Pastone's account of the material effects of real subsumption within the sphere of production thereby already presupposes the concept of value. Capital value shapes the labor process and transforms the labor process into a form adequate to capital, quote, the factory as the physical expression of capital, end quote. Neither, and this is, after all, the crux of Pastone's distinction between a, quote, homogeneous totality, end quote, and a, quote, heterogeneous whole, end quote, do value and use value thereby become identical? Nor is the immediate production process under capitalism identified as a source of value independent of private property in the market, as Pastone's interpreters from the Crisis group would like to have it. Ultimately, it is also the characterization of the types of totality that leaves certain ambiguities unresolved. In fact, three distinct types are involved here. The value-based social principle of unity, explicitly linked to Hegel's concept of totality, is characterized as a, quote, substantially homogeneous totality, end quote. according to which the moments of a whole represent specific forms of a homogeneous principle. This interconnection of labors constituted by value as a form of real homogeneity is said to imprint upon the scientific exposition itself the character of a purely immanent conceptual unfolding. Opposed to this social nexus, established by the abstract general principle of unity, stands concrete social total labor as an ensemble of a multiplicity of particular activities and products. It is only the substantial totality, the shaping of the material labor process by capital, that is introduced as a synthesis of the homogeneous and the heterogeneous. This suggests, though Pistone does not explicitly state it, that Althusser's critical concept of expressive totality, with its implications rooted in the philosophy of identity, might lay full claim to validity regarding the conceptual development of value and its forms. Yet a synthesis of the value aspect and the use value aspect, one that is not rooted in the philosophy of identity, is effected not merely in the exposition of real subsumption, but already in the analysis of the value form in the first chapter of Capital. Without this synthesis, a transition from value to the value form would be impossible. This implies in turn that the value form itself must necessarily draw upon irreducible moments of use value. Thomas Seidel criticizes in one specific respect Pistone's observation regarding the non-identity of the material and value dimensions, even within the labor process under conditions of real subsumption. The central aim underlying the theses of Port and Breuer, namely the assertion of an identity between the value productivity and the use value productivity of capital qua capital, and the attendant assumption that the capital fetish thereby becomes a concrete reality, is subjected to criticism by drawing upon the position of Klaus Türk. Türk argues that the technical and organizational structures of labor, insofar as they are determined by capital, are as such productive of value. Indeed, he suggests they might be designated as, quote, technical and, quote, organizational value forms, end quote. According to Seidel, this approach, which utilizes Marx's theory of real subsumption, effectively attempts to, quote, reduce the theory of surplus value, conceived as a theory of exploitation ad absurdum, end quote, and in so doing to, quote, validate bourgeois economics precisely through the very act of critiquing it, end quote. However, Seidel contends that such attempts merely conflate the material productivity of capital with the value productivity of labor. In reality, the following dictum of Marx holds true, quote, there, bracket, the workers, and bracket, cooperation begins only within the labor process, yet within the labor process they have already ceased to belong to themselves. Upon entering it, they are incorporated into capital. As cooperators, as members of a working organism, they themselves constitute merely a specific mode of existence of capital. The productive power that the worker develops as a social worker is, therefore, the productive power of capital, end quote. Thus, the, quote, synergy effect, end quote, of combined production is not generated through the worker's own act of self-socialization into a productive, quote, organism, but is rather set in motion by capital. The material productivity thus enhanced, the production of a greater quantity of use values within the same amount of labor time does not, however, quote, directly affect exchange value. Whether 100 individuals work together or each of the 100 works separately, the value of their product equals 100 working days, regardless of whether this value is embodied in a large or small number of products. That is to say, it is indifferent to the productivity of labor." End quote. Thus, in the context of cooperation, the value product, which remains determined by the average labor time of the individual workers, is merely distributed across a larger number of products. It does not, however, increase in magnitude, provided that neither the duration of labor time nor the intensity of labor is increased. Consequently, the capital-driven cooperation of workers enhances material productivity without generating any additional value. The augmentation of productive forces, whether through organizational innovations in the labor process or through technical advancements, in no way alters the quantitative parameters of value formation, namely the number of workers, the duration of labor time, and the intensity of labor. Rather, it circumvents these limits through the process of producing relative surplus value. The division of labor time into necessary labor and surplus labor, combined with the increase in productive forces, as it bears upon the means of subsistence of the workforce, enables a quantitative expansion of the valorization process without necessitating a quantitative increase in the total value product. According to Seidel, therefore, it is the actually use-value producing character of capital that gives rise to the illusion of its value-producing character. Therefore, according to Seidel, therefore, it is the actually use-value producing character of capital that gives rise to the illusion of its value-producing character. Okay. And that is the end of Chapter 6 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 3 of the book was titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory, and Chapter 6 is titled The Diagnosis of Crisis, the Historical Decline Critique of Revolutionary Theory. Chapter 6 was the final chapter of Part 3, and the last part of this book is the summary. Thank you so much for listening. Hey everybody, these are the footnotes for Chapter 6 of Part 3 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Chapter 6 is titled Diagnoses of Crisis, the Critique of Revolutionary Theory from the Perspective of Historical Decline. Footnote 2. Prominent, that is, and I should say this from the beginning, I've said this from the other recordings of the footnotes, is that like I'm reading this like after I've already read the chapters, like a while after I've read the chapters, because I was originally not going to include the footnotes. Then I decided that was dumb, and so I'm kind of reading the footnotes kind of like separately, with not reading them right up against the text, so I don't know what is being referred to. So if it's something that usually when you hear something like hear the words like this or something like, or a word that's kind of like that seems to be referencing the text, know that it's not immediately, be conscious that it's not immediately clear what is being referred to. Anyway, footnote 2. Prominent, that is, in comparison with the works of Moll, Zieferle, and others, the actual influence, particularly that of Wolfgang Port and Breuer, is perhaps more evident among those groups and authors who continued to engage with Marx during a period when Marxism, as an academic fad, had already been forced to give way to both post-structuralism and systems theory. Foremost among these are extra-academic circles such as the ISF and Crisis, as well as scholars like Moishe Pastone. Footnote 3. Thus, there is talk of the, quote, annihilation of use values, unquote. Kroll, Hans-Jürgen Kroll. The destruction of the commodity by capital, Port, or even a, quote, society of disappearance, unquote, Breuer. Footnote 4. This optimism had already been subjected to sharp criticism and in significant fashion by Adorno in the aphorism, quote, deviation, from the book Minima Moralia. Footnote 7. In its critique of instrumental reason, this approach aligns more closely with the tradition of Max Weber's Diagnosis of rationalization, a diagnosis that had been incorporated into the Marxist framework. See specifically Marcuse 2004 on this point. This is a topos found perhaps most notably in the work of Georg Lukács, in many respects the seminal classic of Western Marxism. While his combination of Marx's thesis of commodification and Weber's thesis of rationalization is not without its problems, it possesses the advantage of having provided a critique of the domination-related implications of technological rationality long before the theorists discussed here. Footnote 8. Christoph Hesse demonstrates, using the example of Adorno's thesis regarding the replacement of use value by exchange value in modern cultural commodities, just how rarely critical theory's claim to build upon Marx through its categories of cultural critique is actually realized. Footnote 17. This is from Wolfgang Port. Quote, if according to materialist doctrine, human beings form themselves through practical engagement with things, then richly and diversely developed individuals are nothing other than the rich diversity and utility of the objective world as subject. If such engagement with things is lacking, and if the objective world has become monotonous and useless, then the stunting and neglect of individuals is an inevitable consequence. End quote. Wolfgang Port. Footnote 20. It often remains unclear whether he is referring to industrial capital or pre-modern merchant capital. For Port, the capital relation, which is supposed to shatter rigid traditions, actually encompasses, quote, all its precursors and preliminary forms, end quote. Wolfgang Port. Footnote 21, this is a quote from Port. Capital did not invent surplus labor, end quote. Or wait, that might be from the Marx Engels work. No, it is. No, sorry, yeah, that's from Marx. Sorry, I had my footnotes smashed together. Where am I? Footnote 38. On the contrary, using A. Wagner's position as a point of reference, Marx criticizes precisely this earlier thesis from the Grundrisse. In contrast, he explicitly states, quote, I therefore do not divide value into use value and exchange value as opposites in which the abstract entity, quote, value splits itself, end quote. Marx. Port's selective reception of Marx's theory of value, undertaken from the perspective of the Grundrisse, thus constitutes no contribution to an adequate reconstruction of that theory. Footnote 43. Mega. Quote, the surplus labor of the masses has ceased to be the condition for the development of general wealth, end quote. I'm assuming that's Grundrisse, or I believe that's Grundrisse. Footnote 44. Mega. Quote, wealth confronts immediate forced labor not as capital, but as a relation of domination. Therefore, on the basis of such labor, only the relation of domination itself is reproduced, a relation for which wealth itself possesses value solely as a means of enjoyment, not as wealth per se, and which consequently can never give rise to general industry, end quote. Marx, cited in Port 2001. Footnote 50. Nevertheless, the following words by Port contain one of the most apt diagnoses in his book. Quote, one might ask how one can expect people, whom one believes one can only address under the rubric of the voracious object, to rebel. End quote. Port. Footnote 52. In doing so, doing what? However, Port reproduces productivism. For why should the worker as a personal individual be describable in principle by means of the category of the inactive object? Footnote 59. In doing so, in doing what? Port can draw upon Engels. According to this, namely, quote, the transformation of the great establishments for production and communication into joint stock companies and state property demonstrates the dispensability of the bourgeoisie for that purpose. All the social functions of the capitalist are now performed by salaried employees. The capitalist has no further social activity other than pocketing revenues, clipping coupons, and gambling on the stock exchange, where the various capitalists take one another's capital away from each other. If the capitalist mode of production first displaced the workers, it now displaces the capitalists and relegates the capitalists, just like the workers, to the superfluous population, even if for the time being not yet to the industrial reserve army. End quote. Marx Engels Werke. Footnote 62. Quote, living here seems not merely to designate the living human organism, but rather to possess a normative sense. What is meant here is a, quote, card-playing, singing, dancing, end quote, individual, as Port puts it elsewhere. Footnote. Port refers to Marx Engels Werke 23, page 431, or Omega 2, blah, 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 doesn't matter. Quote, the heathens, yes, the heathens. Quote, the heathens, yes, the heathens, end quote. They understood, as the clever Bastiat discovered, and even before him the still cleverer McCulloch, nothing of political economy and Christianity. Among other things, they failed to grasp that the machine is the most effective means for prolonging the working day. For instance, they excused the slavery of one individual as a means for the full human development of another. But to preach the slavery of the masses, in order to turn a few crude or semi-educated parvenus into, quote, eminent spinners, and, quote, extensive sausage makers, and, quote, influential shoe black dealers, and, quote, for that they lack the specifically Christian organ, end quote. Mega. The social democratic labor movement, by contrast, is said to have confined itself in its post-revolutionary phase to the mere redistribution of bourgeois wealth. Thus the insight into the, quote, deformation of products by the false social relation of production, quote. An insight Marx had, albeit ambivalently, still sharpened in the Grundrisse, was lost. In that work, fixed capital was defined as a technology generated by and adequate to capital, and was itself designated as an object of revolutionization, rather than being glorified as a neutral agency of the advancement of productive forces to be adopted intact. Footnote 71. The meaning of sentences such as the following remains the secret of the author and of his brand of cultural criticism, which is particularly receptive to the, quote, emphatic use, and, quote, of living room furniture sets. Quote, living room sets, stereo systems, and high-end stoves sit around in living rooms, bedrooms, and kitchens just as unused and in fact uselessly as they did previously in the shop window. End quote. Wolfgang Port. Footnote 72, quote, thus economic determinations of form posit use value only insofar as they designate a social relationship between persons, and consequently insofar as there exist persons who are distinct from this relationship. End quote. Port. Footnote 73. Like Port, Stefan Breuer also argues that, quote, great bourgeois culture, and quote, is, quote, possible only prior to the definitive establishment of the capital relation, at the threshold between feudal and bourgeois society, where bourgeois individuality still matters, end quote. Breuer. Footnote 92. Mega. Quote, viewed from this aspect, the process of capital coincides with the simple production process as such, wherein its determination as capital is extinguished, end quote. Cited in Port 2001. Footnote 94. In this context, Port, much like Adorno before him, likely employs simple circulation as a methodological construct, as K. Lindner points out. Adorno thereby constructs a chain of associations linking unfulfilled promises of emancipation, freedom and equality, liberalism and simple circulation to a critical standard to be applied against the reality, above all, of late capitalism. Footnote 99. Rational elements of contemporary social diagnosis, such as the observation of the increasing power of commodity aesthetics, Haug, see Haug 1990, that packaging has triumphed over the product, that what is consumed is essentially advertising, see Kroll 1985, or to use Haug's terms, the promise of use value, are already intermingling here with absurd conclusions, such as the quote, the quote, destruction of the commodity by capital, end quote. Kroll. And with nonsensical conceptual monstrosities, such as, quote, totalitarian exchange, end quote, cited in Port 2001. Footnote 100. For a critical perspective on the state monopoly capitalism approach, Stamocap, which also analytically underpins the diagnosis of critical theory, see Outvater 1975. Footnote 121. Quote, and this is from Port, industry, commerce, and politics, obsolete distinctions, end quote. Footnote 124. Capital thus destroys the supposedly system-transcending purposes of capitalists, producers, consumers, and the state. Footnote 172. See Krug, for example, Krug, 1999. He argues that Marx's reflections on the commodity as a, quote, sensuous, supersensuous, end quote, object, quote, defy formal logic, end quote. Or Nachmann, 1999, who without further justification repeats Port's thesis that, quote, the category of socially necessary labor time and its antithesis to surplus labor, a logically compelling post festum category, has been rendered obsolete. Nachmann also asserts that interpreting Port's thesis regarding the end of the sphere of circulation as a, quote, negative state monopoly capitalism theory, end quote, constitutes a, quote, misinterpretation, end quote. He attempts to salvage Port's approach by, on the one hand, conceding the, quote, reinstallation, end quote, of the exchange process in post-fascist Germany, yet on the other insisting with portentous gravity that this process be understood merely as a, quote, semblance of a semblance, as a bloodless specter, as a desubstantialized process, end quote. Port. This desubstantialization, which he locates in the, quote, metaphysicization, indeed the magicization of banal junk, end quote, as an identity-forming communal experience, functioning as it were as a Volksgemeinschaft-style use value. It is, however, a tenuous thesis on the one hand, particularly when one considers the aforementioned living room furniture sets discussed by Port, and on the other, a category alien to Marxian critique of political economy, For therein the existence of circulation was neither characterized by the term, quote, substantial, end quote, nor would such a characterization have made any sense within the framework of Marx's Capital. Footnote 129. The term is borrowed from Adorno. I don't know which term. Breuer had already criticized this latter variant, a, quote, ontology of labor, end quote, in 1974, doing so on the basis of Rudi Dutschke's position. Footnote 141. Koenig's thesis regarding a general subjectivist tendency in the concept of capital within Marx's early works is scarcely plausible. One can find manifold textual passages in which Marx emphasizes the primacy of structure and the autonomous dynamics of capitalism. The only thesis that seems correct to me is that prior to the Grundrisse, Marx was unable to explain either the specific nature of capital or its dynamics. Footnote 143. Quote, indeed, it still appears to be his labor that man performs, labor which is wrested from him only retrospectively after its completion. End quote. And that quote is from Koenig. Footnote 149. Moich-Bastien would later do the same, whatever the same is. Quote, the social form is a totality because it is constituted by a general and homogeneous, quote, substance that is its own ground. Since this totality grounds itself, mediates itself, and objectifies itself, it exists quasi-independently, end quote. Pastone. In the mode of presentation of Marx's Capital, it is implied that capitalism exists as a, quote, homogeneous totality, end quote, quote, that can be unfolded from a single structuring principle, end quote. Pastone. However, there is a crucial difference compared to the Breuer-Koenig line. See below regarding this point. Footnote 158, quote, in the production process, the separation of labor from labor's objective moments of existence, instrument and material is suspended. The existence of capital and wage labor rests upon this separation. End quote. Mega. Footnote 164. And I think this is from the Mega. Quote, we therefore had no need to depict the worker in relation to other workers, man and his labor on the one side, nature and its materials on the other, sufficed, end quote. Dieter Wolf, 2005b, draws attention to the specific character of the level of representation of the simple labor process, a level which, on the one hand, performs an abstraction from all social aspects that bring about the genesis and reproduction of specifically human competencies, thought, language, physical organization, etc., but which, on the other hand, must not entail an abstraction from the results of these social processes, lest it fall into a false abstraction regarding, quote, the instinct-like operations of certain animals, end quote. Quote, one abstracts from the sociality of labor, without which thought and speech cannot be explained. Nevertheless, once this has been done, the remaining aspect of social labor is examined without falling back into animalistic instinct-like protoforms of labor. End quote. Wolff. Furthermore, Wolff distinguishes between the determinations of the simple labor process conceived as an, quote, abstract one-sided relation of an already given concrete whole, end quote, or alternatively as one aspect of the overall production process of a specific epoch, and the, quote, technico-social form of organization, end quote, of that same process, a form which, under capitalism, is conditioned by the specifically social form of labor, abstract labor, and the imperatives of accumulation inherent to it. Accordingly, cooperation, manufacture, and large-scale industry represent, albeit historically successive, determinations of the shaping of the simple labor process under the influence of capital, within the context of capital. However, these are to be viewed as following one another in a logically systematic sequence. Thus, following Wolff, it is possible to reject the conflation of the levels of abstraction regarding social labor and the simple labor process, a conflation that Koenig engages in only to subsequently impute it to Marx. Footnote 168, Mega. Quote, the past labor embodied in the labor power and the living labor it is capable of performing, its daily maintenance costs and its daily expenditure are two entirely different magnitudes, end quote. Mega. Quote, in the production process itself, however, the active labor power takes the place of the 90 pounds ST advanced. Living labor takes the place of the dead labor. A flowing magnitude takes the place of a static magnitude. A variable magnitude takes the place of a constant one. The result is the reproduction of V, I guess it's variable capital, plus an increment of variable capital. It pass M. I don't know if I'm saying that right at all. Footnote 176, and this is from the Mega, quote, as independent persons, the workers are isolated individuals who enter into a relationship with the same capital, but not with one another. Their cooperation begins only within the labor process. Yet within the labor process, they have already ceased to belong to themselves. Upon entering it, they are incorporated into capital. As cooperators, as members of a working organism, they themselves constitute merely a particular mode of existence of capital. The productive force that the worker develops as a social worker is therefore a productive force of capital. End quote. Mega. Footnote 179. Furthermore, according to Breuer, the quote, totalization of technology so thoroughly infects thought that, by committing itself to quantifiability and empirical verifiability, it forfeits its quote, intelligible elements. Thereby the tension between ideality and reality, the very foundation of all critique, is dissolved and flattened out into the merely given, or rather into a mere reflection thereof. Footnote 82. Breuer speaks of the elimination of the, quote, empiricity of production, end quote, because the instrument of labor, quote, which in artisanal production still served as the connecting medium between the goal-setting will of the producer and nature, end quote, is being, quote, socialized, and is thereby being, quote, detached from its specific external experiential bond to the subject, end quote. Breuer. Why, however, this should be detrimental to the formation of a revolutionary consciousness remains Breuer's secret. One begins to suspect that Breuer is advocating a romanticization and idealization of artisanal modes of production. Footnote 189. Such positions are frequently found in the discourse of the, quote, New Marx reading, Neue Marx-Lektura. See merely the already mentioned Anselm Joppe, who interprets Marx's ironic statement that according to the concept of capital, as a balance sheet entry, 4 would equal 5, as a wholly unironic description of the, quote, real mysticism, end quote, of capitalism. Hans-Georg Bench, 1995, strikes a similar note with the following statement, quote, it is the distinctive feature of Karl Marx, in his magnum opus Capital, to have defined value as self-valorizing value, as, quote, greater than itself, end quote. End quote. Hans-Georg Bench. However, the statement that capital is value that is greater than itself is articulated by Marx clearly and explicitly as the false semblance of the interest-bearing fetish. Quote, finally, in interest-bearing capital, the circulation, money commodity, money prime, presents itself in an abbreviated form in its result, without mediation, so to speak, in a lapidary style as money, money prime, money that equals more money, value that is greater than itself. Marx. Yet it is precisely the demonstration of this mediation that is of sole importance. This constitutes the distinctive feature of Marx's work. Regarding this matter, see also the critique by Rakowitz and Bera, 2001, as well as Elbe, 2008, more generally. Footnote 190. Not as Breuer, 1985, puts it, a, quote, relation between persons that appears only in a reified form, end quote. Footnote 91. See the classic formulation by Georg Lukács, quote, the essence of the commodity structure rests on the fact that a relation, a connection between persons acquires the character of reification, and in this way, a, quote, spectral objectivity, end quote, Lukács. See by contrast the apt critique of Lukács' student Agnes Heller in König, 1977. Heller too observes that, quote, in capitalist society, interpersonal relationships, and thus need as well, appear as reified relationships, yet in reality they remain interpersonal, end quote. Heller. Footnote 192. Walter Tuchscherer points out that, as early as the Mill excerpts of 1844, Marx was already elaborating a concept of objective mediation and real inversion. The, quote, mediating movement between the exchanging individuals is not a human relationship, but rather the abstract relationship of private property to private property, and this abstract relationship is value, end quote. Tuchscherer. Footnote 193. Rather, it is a production relationship between human beings, mediated through things, manifesting itself in things, and appearing as a thing, whereby these things are involuntarily placed into a social relationship with one another by the human beings, under specific pre-existing conditions of the socialization of their labor. Footnote 197. Indeed, in the context of the concept of the bourgeoisie, König consistently speaks of a, quote, autonomous and strong, end quote, group of the capitalist as a person who is, quote, compelled to compensate for the still imperfect force of economic relations through his own authority and strength of will, end quote. König. 200. Footnote 200. Quote, exchange value, a mere mental construct in relation to use value, rules over human need, and in its stead, appearance rules over reality. In this respect, society is a myth, and its demystification is as imperative today as it ever was. Yet at the same time, that very appearance constitutes the ultimate reality, the formula by which the world has been bewitched, end quote, Adorno. Footnote 205. König refers primarily to Marx's critique, found in the Grundrisse, of attempts within political economy to deny the existence of overproduction crises. Footnote 212. Mega, quote, production supplies the need not only with a material, but it also supplies the material with a need. ... Production therefore produces not only an object for the subject, but also a subject for the object, end quote. Marx. Footnote 220. Consequently, quote, the consumers would have held a plebiscite regarding the sense or nonsense of products, end quote. König. Footnote 227. He argues, and I think this is a reference to Breuer, 1979, argues, as Port did previously, that, quote, great bourgeois culture, end quote, is, quote, only possible prior to the final establishment of the capital relation, at the threshold between feudal and bourgeois society, at which point bourgeois individuality still matters, end quote. Breuer. 1977, actually. Footnote 239. Conversely, authors such as Gallas attempt to derive a, quote, breaching of the bourgeois legal horizon from the delegation of individual power of disposal over labor power to trade union collective actors, as well as from the initially at least illegal forms of struggle employed by the proletariat in the class struggle, a fact he conveniently overlooks. However, it seems to escape him that, on the contrary, the class struggle is concerned, among other things, with the juridification of the sphere of production and the enforcement of the workers' right to the preservation of their labor power. Where wishful thinking prevails, even the struggle for every meager piece of social legislation where wishful thinking prevails, even the struggle for every meager piece of social legislation is stylized into the exercise of a, quote, privileged epistemic position, end quote, on the part of the proletariat, indeed into a struggle against the very logic of the system. Footnote: the critique of strategies of immanent critique is also the central theme of Eber's 2005 work. Footnote 254. Quote, on the other hand, they, private laborers, satisfied the manifold needs of their own producers only insofar as every particular useful private labor is interchangeable with every other useful private labor. That is, insofar as it is a matter of indifference to it, end quote. Marx. Footnote 257. What a critique of, quote, objectively mediated, end quote, socialization means in Marx, and what it does not, is set out in precise detail by Dieter Wolf, 1985. Footnote. See Pistone, quote, homogeneous totality, which can be unfolded from a single structuring principle, end quote. Pistone. See likewise with reference to Hegel, Bader et al., 1975. (275) Zeidel's thesis regarding the fragmentation of the capital fetish in the course of the crisis of Taylorist work organization and the introduction of group work will not be discussed further here. Zeidel's assertion that we are dealing here with a new form of formal subsumption and directly self-organized socialization of workers within the workplace, which alone allows the, quote, metaphysics of labor, end quote, and its hopes for revolutionary theory to become reality, remain at the very least questionable. Neither is the self-organized character of this process evident, something Zeidel himself is compelled to concede. Quote, subjugation of the female worker's entire personality by means of participatory work organization, end quote. Quote, workplace syndicalist tendencies and segmentation of the workforce, end quote. Nor is it plausible why this should cause the fetishism of capital to crumble. Even assuming this were the case, it would still remain to be explained how this could possibly undermine the mystification of the wage, a phenomenon that occupies a central position within the broader ideological complex of delusion. However, one must agree with Zeidel on this point, that under capitalism, contrary to the assumption made by Pistone following Braverman, no linear tendency toward descaling can be observed. And that's the end of the footnotes for Chapter 6 of Part 3 of Ingo Elbe's Marx in the West, the new reading of Marx in the Federal Republic since 1965. Part 3 of the book was titled The Crisis of Revolutionary Theory, and Chapter 6, which is the final chapter of Part 3, and Part 3 being the final part of the book. This is the last chapter of the book prior to the next to the summary section. God, it sounded like an idiot spitting that out. Anyway, Chapter 6, Diagnoses of Crises, was called Diagnoses of Crises, the Critique of Revolutionary Theory from the Perspective of Historical Decline. Thank you so much for listening.